And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless. Hey guys, this is Standing for Truth and Raw Matt, and we are going to debunk Bill Nye the Science Guy. As you're going to see here, Bill Nye makes a lot of claims. This is going to be a lengthy video, but it's going to take a lot of detailed and at times technical information to debunk everything he is saying. Bill Nye, you're going to see, talks about how evolution is a fact. But at the end of the day, a theory needs actual evidence for support. The evidence against evolution is overwhelming. Just to go over a few that I can guarantee Bill Nye will not be able to address is the fact that the very best claimed evidence for evolutionism has been destroyed. For example, they'll tell us that humans and chimpanzees are so identical genetically that their genetic identity is 98 or even 99% similar, but this is based on preferential and selective treatment of data. The actual identity is around 88% similar. And just to put that into perspective, that's 400 million DNA differences that exist between the two species. Humans are fundamentally different from all other forms of life when we actually consider genomics and functionality. The fact is, we see that genetic change is actually down and not up. We are therefore devolving due to mutation accumulation. Bill Nye will not be able to address the fact that the human mutation rate is alarmingly high. It's approximately 100 new mutations per person per generation. I debated Dr. Stephan Frello on this, and he had absolutely no argument. His only arguments were misunderstandings of the model of genetic entropy, because genetic entropy, genetic degeneration, is a fact. That means evolutionists such as Bill Nye, they commit the extrapolation fallacy. They'll look at change today and take that back long ago and far away and conclude that banana plants, whales, pine trees, and dogs are related through common ancestry. As you will see Bill Nye admit in a clip right here that bananas and humans are related. And he asks Ken Ham, what's the evidence to the contrary? Now, as we can see, Bill Nye has no evidence that banana plants and humans are related, because as I was saying earlier, the mutations, deleterious mutations are catastrophic. They lead to disease, they destroy, they corrupt. And these mutations, they're not a creative force. They degrade, they destroy, and they're entering the human population at a rate much faster than natural selection could possibly select away such mutations. Natural selection acts upon the phenotype and not the genotype. Natural selection will amplify the best beneficial mutations and get rid of the worst detrimental mutations, but natural selection can't see most mutations, and that's why they build up these low impact, near neutral mutations. They have such trivial effects on fitness that natural selection can do nothing about them. And the extremely high human mutation rate, it really is a profound problem. And the fact that these harmful mutations are only going to have a tiny effect on fitness, as I've said, that means most harmful mutations are essentially invisible to the natural selection process. And that means human genomes, and apparently all genomes, must be accumulating harmful mutations continuously, such that genomes must eventually rust out like rust on a car. It's continuous and it's destructive. Artificial mechanisms such as synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, the rescue devices that have been employed by population geneticists, they've been falsified. At the end of the day, all evidence, the best evidence evolutionism and Bill Nye here would have to offer, has been destroyed. They'll say that human chromosome number 2 arose from a fusion of two ape-like chromosomes. But the fact is, the purported fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. A lot of their so-called best evidence that Bill Nye would look to and can't refute the argument against is based on junk DNA, and the junk DNA era has been completely overturned and is no longer a valid form of evidence for evolutionists. For example, they'll say that humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes, aka pseudogenes. But pseudogenes, we now know, are functional DNA elements and not mistakes. Many of their most praised examples of pseudogenes or genetic markers have been overturned. The ENCODE project has revealed that over 80% of our genome is actively transcribed into RNA. They'll say that gene order along chromosomes has no function. They'll look to this to demonstrate common ancestry, but once again, the gene order along chromosome does indeed play important functional roles. And these nested hierarchies we see, the relative hierarchies across life, are characteristics of design. Everything we see points to a biblical base model and refutes a model of universal common ancestry. He says bananas and humans are related, but
from your perspective, all life is related?
Certainly.
So we're related to a banana?
Yes.
Okay.
We can actually look at Lenski's experiment. And this experiment is extremely significant, but what's funny is it's for opposite reasons. The bacteria, the E. coli bacteria in this experiment, they have not experienced forward evolution. Thousands and thousands and thousands, over 60,000 generations of bacteria. And we have learned that bacteria produce bacteria, and yet Bill Nye here wants to say that bacteria, banana plants, and humans are related through common ancestry. It's not even a good theory. It's not even a good hypothesis. There's no evidence. And in this experiment, the net effect has been reductive evolution. It's evolution going backwards. Yes, there's been some adaptation in this artificial environment, but it's been mainly due to loss of function mutations. And this type of adaptive fine-tuning, at best, can be called microevolution. And the fact that it's being accomplished through a net loss of information, for example, broken genes, deletions, broken functional systems, losing genes short-term, long-term degeneration, disrupted gene regulation. This is evolution going the wrong way. In all 12 experimental populations in this experiment, the functional bacterial genome has shrunk. It contains less total information. I'd love to see Bill Nye address this. This bacteria will quickly go extinct in any natural environment. If Bill Nye wants to use any type of experiment to say that humans came from something that was non-human, dogs came from something that was non-dog, dogs, humans, whales, and banana plants are related through common ancestry, this would be the experiment. And yet, at the end of the day, this experiment, which should have validated large macroevolution, has demonstrated very powerfully that the mutation and selection process has extremely serious limitations. They are not creative mechanisms. Mutations destroy. And so even given huge, massive populations and vast numbers of generations, this experiment, all that was accomplished was a very small, a trivial amount of adaptive microevolution, and we don't disagree with adaptation. We look to adaptation, we predict adaptation. The evolutionists will say, well, there's a trade-off. And although there has been some superficial fine-tuning happening in a handful of genomic sites, no one disagrees with this. Significant genetic damage has been accumulating throughout the rest of the genome, and many due to slightly harmful deleterious mutations that natural selection cannot act upon. They cannot be selected away. This means in the long run, the net effect will be degeneration, just like we see in the universe. Everything is winding down. Time is their god. With enough time, anything can be related to anything, but given a model population such as these bacteria, that would be optimal for validating evolution, proves that populations do not evolve, they actually de-evolve. Sorry, Bill Nye.
This was a conscious decision. I'm going to influence kids. I'm going to influence young people. Look at this sheet I produced for everybody who came to work on the show. This is in 1992. It says, the objective, change the world. That's the objective. That was the goal of the show. If you have this idea that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, you are denying, if you will, everything that you can touch and see.
There are many lines of evidence that we could use along this way of thinking. The recession of the moon, for example, I brought this up previously with a debate with you, Ross. I thought he's had a few years to think about it. He might have an answer to it now. The moon is moving away from the Earth due to tidal forces. And we know that tidal forces go as 1 over r to the 6th power, which means as the moon moves further away, it slows down, which means if you run the movie backwards, it gets faster and faster and faster. And the uniformitarian assumption would be it's always been 1 over r to the 6th, right? And so if you run that movie backwards, you'd find that in 1.4 billion years they collide. And again, that's an upper limit because they can't be closer than 0. Okay, so it's not a problem for a few thousand years where the moon would have just been a few hundred feet closer to the Earth, but it is a problem if you believe the Earth and moon are 4.5 billion years old. Spiral galaxy wrapping. You know, spiral galaxies, they actually wind themselves up with time. The inner portions rotate faster than the outer portions. We can measure that. We can measure the Doppler shifts of those stars. So for example, you have in the Whirlpool galaxy here. That's the linear velocity. When you convert it to angular, the inner portions rotate a lot quicker than the outer portions. And in fact, I've actually been able to simulate this. Let's see if it's going to play. It's not going to play, is it? Oh well. It wraps itself up ridiculously fast. I'll show you an image of the final result here in just a minute. My secular colleagues say, well, density waves come and form new spiral arms, but they believe the material is very tightly wrapped, in which case the magnetic fields should be very tightly wrapped because magnetic fields travel with material. They don't travel with density waves. And so we'd expect the magnetic fields would be very tightly wrapped if this galaxy is billions of years old, but in fact the magnetic fields line right up with the spiral arms, what you'd expect if it's thousands of years old. So basically, if galaxies are 6,000 years old, they ought to look something like that because they haven't had a lot of time to wrap themselves up. I believe God created them spirals and they've wrapped just a little bit. This is the result of the simulation. That's for a 1 billion year old galaxy. That's what it would look like based on the measured rates of rotations of the star, revolutions of the stars. And galaxies are supposed to be 10 billion years old in the secular view. Okay? What do we find? Well, we observe that galaxies look like they're thousands of years old. It's interesting to me because you'll hear people say, well, why does the universe look so old? I'm thinking, what universe are you looking at? Not the real one. The internal heat of the Jovian planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune, give off more energy than they receive from the sun by a factor of about 2, something like that. And they can't do that forever because they're losing energy, right? They're expending fuel. You can't keep giving away more than you take in unless you're the federal government. But anyway, they can't do that forever. They're going to run out of heat, you see. And so, like take a potato out of the microwave. It's nice and warm. It's radiating that heat to space. Now Jupiter's a bigger potato. It can do that for a lot longer, but it can't do it for billions of years. And that is an issue in the secular view. Magnetic fields actually decay with time. We've actually been able to measure the Earth's magnetic field dropping over, we've been able to measure it for almost 2 centuries. It's an exponential decay from those measurements, and that's what we'd expect on the basis of just basic physics. We'd expect that it would decay exponentially. There's a sinusoidal perturbation on top of that. Now we think during the global flood, the tectonic motions would have affected that magnetic field, disrupted the currents, and you'd cause rapid reversals and things like that. But putting that aside and just assuming uniformitarianism, for the sake of argument, the magnetic field would just have been stronger in the past. It has we can measure the exponential decay. We know it has a half-life of 1,400 years. That means every 1,400 years it drops by a factor of 2. You run it back 6,000 years, it had been 20 times stronger at creation. That'd be kind of nice because that gives us increased protection from cosmic rays and things of that nature. If you run it back even 50,000 years, the magnetic field would have been 56 billion times stronger than it is today, enough to rip the iron right out of your blood. In fact, if you go back to 60,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field would have been as strong as a neutron star, which is the most powerful magnetic fields we know in the universe. It would rip your atoms apart. So it just can't be that old. Again, assuming uniformitarianism. It can't be that old. My secular colleagues are aware of this. And by the way, it's not just the Earth. The other planets of the solar system, a lot of them have strong magnetic fields. And my secular colleagues said, well, there must be some kind of recharging mechanism, you see. But they have to violate their own uniformitarian assumptions to get that, because the decay appears to be exponential as far as we can tell. And also their recharging mechanism, which they call a magnetic dynamo, predicted that the magnetic fields would be well aligned with the rotation axis of these worlds, and it's not for many of the planets like Uranus and Neptune. It's not even close. In fact, my secular colleagues were expecting that the planet Uranus should have basically no magnetic field at all because it has no internal heat. And you need internal heat to drive that dynamo to recharge the magnetic field, allegedly. On the other hand, my colleague, Dr. Russ Humphreys, he's got a model for how God may have started the magnetic fields. It's really clever. And this is one of the few estimates that is giving us a true age estimate rather than just an upper limit. Based on Humphreys' model, the magnetic field of the planet Uranus should be within that little blue strip that you see there at the top. It should be somewhere between those two values. My secular colleagues believed that the magnetic field should be basically non-existent for the planet Uranus. And when Voyager 2 went past the planet and measured the magnetic field, the measured magnetic field is that. It's consistent with 6,000 years of decay. Isn't that interesting? It's nowhere close to what you'd expect for billions of years. Comets are another example. Comets are balls of ice and dirt, and they orbit the sun on elliptical paths, coming close to the sun and then swinging back out far away. And they lose material when they come close to the sun. And that's what forms a comet's tail. It's material being blasted away. We know the rate at which the material is leaving. We know the size of the comet. You can estimate a typical comet could last no more than about 100,000 years maximum before it totally runs out of material. And yet we still got comets. So if the solar system's billions of years old, why do we still have comets? My secular colleagues said, well, there's an Oort cloud that makes new ones. Basically a comet generator that we can't detect, but it makes new ones every now and then. And they're welcome to speculate on that, but I call that a rescuing device because, you see, I don't think there's any evidence for an Oort cloud. The bottom line is comets are an indication of the youth of the universe, or at least of our solar system, and there's evidence that other solar systems have comets too. So if the solar system is 6,000 years old, that's what we should see. If it's billions of years old, that's what we should see, which is to say we shouldn't see any comets, and in fact we do see comets. Blue stars are another example of the youth of the universe. We find blue stars ubiquitous in spiral galaxies, especially in the spiral arms. And they're beautiful, and they cannot last even tens of millions of years. And my secular colleagues will acknowledge that, because blue stars, even though they have a lot of fuel, they expend it very quickly, kind of like an SUV. They got a big tank, but they don't get very good gas mileage. So they can't last billions of years, and yet we find them everywhere in the universe. Everywhere in the universe. And my secular colleagues won't even argue the age. They know that blue stars can't last long. And so they'll say new ones must be constantly forming. But you know, we've never seen a star form anywhere in the universe, which is interesting. In fact, to get gas to condense and fall into itself and form a star is really problematic. Gas wants to expand. I think you know that. You didn't hold your breath when you came into the room in case all the air should go to that corner. You expected the air to expand and fill the room, and that's what it naturally does. Now, once God makes a star, its own gravity will hold it together. But in space, the force of gravity is tiny compared to the force of gas pressure in a typical situation. So in a 6,000-year-old universe, you'd expect to find lots of varieties of stars. Red stars can last long periods of time. It doesn't mean they're old, it just means they can last that long. Blue stars can't. You'd expect to find both. If the universe were billions of years old, you'd expect only the red ones would be left. Or you'd at least see stars in the process of forming, and what we do see is consistent with thousands of years. Really compelling. Of course, there's a lot of other lines of evidence I could mention that are indicative of youth, and I don't offer these as proof, because as I mentioned earlier, you can't prove scientifically the age of something. I'm just showing you that there's an inconsistency in the secular way of thinking in terms of uniformitarianism and naturalism. In many instances, it leads to results that are inconsistent with its own assumptions.
Somebody from public broadcasting called the office and said, no, be sure to say it's only a theory, evolution. I said, no, I'm not going to say it's only a theory. You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another.
Bill Nye here looks to the fossil record, to the geologic column. But what the fossil record actually supports, contrary to what Bill Nye would want all the kids to believe, is death and burial on a global scale. And guess what? This is exactly what the Bible describes in Genesis with the global flood of Noah. The existence of a fossil in general is absolute proof that it happened quickly. For example, environmental factors would prevent that organism from forming. But if it's covered, and any geologist can tell you this, if it's covered by sediment and protected, the fossilization process can start. And the fossil record and geology itself prove biblical creation in the Genesis flood. We see rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. We see flat, featureless boundaries. We find whole rock layer sequences deposited rapidly in quick succession. Now, Bill Nye here, he'll say you've got this type of fossil in this layer, and you can see this in this clip in his debate with Ken Ham, and he'll say you got these types of fossils in these layers, and they think that it goes from marine fossils to land fossils in the order of pond scum to people evolution. But Bill Nye's lying. He's incorrect, because we've got marine fossils all the way through. Even with dinosaur fossils, what do we have? We've got marine fossils buried with them. This means, and it is a fact, especially because we read about this global flood in the Bible, it's a historical account. The order of the fossils is the burial order of the flood. And so if the flood began in the ocean, ripping up all those marine creatures and burying them onto the continents, they would be the first creatures to be buried. And as the floodwaters rose higher and higher, you get the burial of the land animals. And this is all exactly what we find. This means that everywhere we look, there's an abundance of evidence from geology that the flood really did occur. Nothing in the fossils, as Bill Nye here looks to, supports evolution. Bill Nye, he says that certain fossils should not be found with other fossils. And this is proof of evolutionary descent with modification. It's one of his biggest arguments. But the thing is, and the fact is, we do, and what the evolutionist does is change their stories and create rescue device after rescue device after rescue device. Evolutionary theory in and of itself is so absolutely rubbery, they can move it around and accommodate almost anything, and this isn't science. For example, dinosaurs and man did not live in the same habitat. Just like today, different creatures and different animals live in different habitats. In the pre-flood world, we see certain fossils that are usually buried together. And dinosaur fossils are usually buried with, say, gymnosperms, whereas mammal fossils are usually buried with things such as flowering plants. What does this indicate? It indicates two different ecosystems. Bill Nye doesn't understand or even want to look into the model of flood geology. Dinosaurs, for example, although they lived at the same time of man, did not necessarily live in the same areas or habitats. They were overcome by the flood at different times during the advancing of the waters, which explains why we don't find them buried together. Burial by ecosystems and habitats is just one of the many reasons and explanations for the flood layers and the fossils within the flood layers. We can even read in Genesis that the land of Eden, we are told, a river flows out of Eden. And we know rivers flow downhill. And so Eden was obviously at a higher elevation. We know certain animals, such as certain dinosaurs, lived in swampy lowland areas, and so various animals of various ecosystems and habitats were separated from man and other forms of life. And we can look to other explanations such as body density, intelligence, mobility, and of course habitats and ecosystems. At the end of the day, there is evidence that the earth was once underwater. We see marine fossils on mountains, in areas, landlocked areas that are actually far from the sea. Sedimentary rock layers extend over entire continents or even farther. That means the deposition of those layers had to have been catastrophic, or as I said earlier, there would not have been much fossilization. So how is Bill Nye going to explain the fact that we see fossils of animals giving birth, fish being eaten? All this suggests sudden and rapid burial. So all these observations they're in accord with the flood of Noah, covering the entire earth just a few thousand years ago. And at the end of the day, Bill Nye talks about how creationists don't make predictions. Well, when we look at the continents today, what are they doing? They're moving only very little. But when we look to Noah's flood, the flood is described in Genesis, we aren't looking at continental drift anymore, obviously. We are looking at continental sprint. The Bible tells us that the fountains of the great deep is broken open. The earth is fractured like an eggshell. Continents are moving vertically, horizontally. And this model of catastrophic plate tectonics, continental sprint, predicts that the pre-flood ocean crust would be dragged down into the mantle. This is a process that we call subduction. Bill Nye will know of this. Now, because that happened recently, of course, according to our model, say only a few thousand years ago, the cold ocean crust should still be cold, even though I think anybody can see that it has descended into the deep hot mantle. Now, modern seismologists have discovered that there are indeed huge cold slabs of rock down near the core itself, in areas that should have warmed up, if millions of years, of course, worth of time. They look to time. Deep time is their God. And they would say that this is what would have brought those slabs down instead of Noah's flood. But the fact that we have cold slabs of rock is absolute confirmation of flood geology and not old age geology. This is a confirmed prediction. Bill Nye clearly hasn't looked into creationist predictions. Future predictions, confirmed predictions, creationists are making them. Another amazing prediction, one of many, that has been confirmed in CPT is rapid magnetic reversals. The Earth's magnetic field draws our compass needle towards the north, but sometimes in Earth's history it draws it towards the south. Now, old age geologists believe that this has been happening for hundreds of millions of years and would have taken thousands of years to occur. It was old Earth geologists, as a matter of fact, that found confirming evidence of rapid magnetic reversals. And guess what? These are required for Noah's flood. They were taking a look at lava flows that would only take a couple of weeks in order to form. They took measurements of the skin of the lava to see the magnetic orientation. They were expecting to see almost no change as they went deeper into the hot lava, where the interior shift only slightly. Instead, what they found was the outside skin pointed north and the inside pointed south. So once again, we have confirming evidence from lava flows that the switch of magnetic field has to happen rapidly, which is exactly what flood geologists expected.
What do the rock layers show? Well, they show that the ocean waters flooded over the continents. How do I know that? Because there are marine fossils in rock layers covering the continents. That's right, marine fossils. Wouldn't you expect if they were marine that creatures lived in the ocean, they'd buried in the ocean? Well, why are they buried up on the continents? They had to get transported, lifted up by the floodwaters and dumped up on the continents. And wouldn't you and I expect to find widespread, rapidly deposited rock layers because the flood was a global and it went all around the Earth? Yes. We find rock layers that can be traced all the way across continents and even between continents. Let me give you examples. The Tapeats sandstone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's the first layer of the flood. It sits on that erosion surface that marks the beginning of the flood. There we can see it. That's the view from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. That little cliff at the bottom there sitting on top of an erosion surface. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. We can study its characteristics. You know what? We can trace that sandstone in outcrop and in drill holes all the way across North America, across to Greenland. You can go to Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin and you can see exactly the same sandstone with exactly the same features sitting on exactly the same erosion surface, sitting on the same crystalline basement. You can see it on a road cut in Missouri as well, in between. The same sandstone can be traced right across North Africa, right over to southern Israel, at Timnah. You've got the same sandstone with the same fossils, the same features, with the same erosion surface sitting on the same crystalline basement. Only a global flood would do that. The Redwall limestone in Grand Canyon. Why, by the way, geologists are pretty smart. Why do you think they call it the Redwall limestone? Because it's a limestone that forms a red wall. And it has unique features. You know, I was in Ireland nearly 3 years ago, and Killarney Castle is built on this rock here, and my eyes boggled. It's exactly the same limestone as in the Grand Canyon. The same features, the same fossils, exactly the same level. You can trace it across to England in the Yorkshire Dales, and you can, by the way, it's the same limestone in the Appalachians as well, so you got it in between, and you find the same limestone in the Himalayas. That's right, there's marine fossils near the top of Mount Everest. It's made out of flood-deposited fossil rocks. By the way, this is my last example, the chalk cliffs of England. Remember we looked under the microscope, this type of limestone is made up of trillions of microscopic shellfish. What I didn't tell you last time is that you can trace that limestone across the Northern Ireland, but you can also trace it across Europe to Germany, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, all the way down to Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Kazakhstan. By the way, at the bottom of that cliff, a shepherd boy picked up 5 smooth stones to slay a giant. There's the same chalk beds as on the English Channel coast. And we've got the same chalk in the Midwest of the United States, from Alabama across to Colorado, from Nebraska to Texas. The same chalk beds. By the way, the same chalk beds are found in southern Western Australia. That's a global scale fossil graveyard made up of all these trillions of microscopic shellfish. Well, what do the scientists say about the formation of this limestone called chalk? They say the chalk beds formed over millions of years as lime grain by lime grain and tiny shell by tiny shell fell to the ocean floor. They say a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years. Oh, but that's on the ocean floor. Where do we find the chalk? Up on the continent. And what other fossils are buried in the chalk beds? Well, if we go to the Niobrara chalk in Kansas, we find it's full of crinoids, perfectly formed crinoids that had to be catastrophically buried. Or this fish didn't get time to digest its food. You see the size of that fish? It's 12 foot long. Would you bury that a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years? The fish would have digested itself and swam away, wouldn't it? Or in the same chalk bed, you've got pliosaur fossils and turtle fossils 10 and 12 feet long across. You've got dinosaur fossils and bird fossils in the same chalk beds. How would you gradual, grain by grain, a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years on the ocean floor over millions of years, bury together such large sea, land and air-dwelling creatures on the continents, not on the ocean floor? See my point? Only if the ocean waters rose and swept across the continents, catastrophically burying these land and sea and air-dwelling creatures all together in this global scale fossil graveyard that's the chalk beds. Only the flood makes sense of that kind of evidence.
When there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did.
Thousands of dinosaur trackways up and down this peninsula, plus similar temporarily exposed low areas on other continents, suggest that dying dinosaurs and other hardy track makers floated, waded, and walked on freshly deposited mud, trying to find safe ground. The fact that over a dozen states in the U.S. are filled with dinosaur fossils buried under heaps of mud also attests to the flood. In fact, geologists have found a temporarily exposed dinosaur peninsula where the dinosaurs made their last stand, now buried there along with lake and sea life transported by the massive waves. Now buried across it are pre-flood wetland plants and animals, including dinosaurs, turtles, frogs, fish, and many birds. Next, the massive Zuni megasequence hits. The Absaroka and Zuni megasequences are the most severe because the continental plates began to move more quickly from the original Pangea-like supercontinent configuration to where they are today. With oceanic rifting and plate subduction increasing dramatically and the continents traveling apart quickly, the tsunami-like waves began washing across western North America while virtually no sedimentation is occurring in the east. When coming up over the Dinosaur Peninsula, the Zuni catastrophically buries dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation, a 13-state area encompassing over 700,000 square miles. This Jurassic unit includes at least 141 massive dinosaur boneyards where dinosaurs like Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Allosaurus are found. The Cretaceous layers, like the Hill Creek Formation, are found on top of the Jurassic and hold hundreds of mass boneyards containing several different types of dinosaurs, such as T-Rex, Triceratops, Centrosaurus, and Edmontosaurus that had been living in a different ecosystem, also buried by the Zuni. The Zuni was so massive and fast that it engulfed entire regions with mudflow, burying giant creatures like this T-Rex under 50 feet of muddy sediment, entombed so quickly that preserved blood cells, blood vessels, and bone cells were found just recently. how much water does it take to pile 50 feet of mud on top of a dinosaur? The Dinosaur National Monument in Utah contains thousands of visible bones from 11 kinds of dinosaurs that were buried in a jumbled mass in the Morrison Formation, together with crocodiles, turtles, lizards, frogs, and clams. What type of event would it take to bury all these different land animals with millions of clams? When the Dinosaur Peninsula floods over completely, large herds of dinosaurs are entombed in massive fossil graveyards in the Upper Cretaceous system found in northern Wyoming, Montana, and Alberta, Canada. The dinosaurs had tried to escape by fleeing northward up the peninsula as waters advanced from the south. This explains this massive graveyard in northern Montana that's over 1.2 miles long and contains 30 million fossil fragments, representing over 10,000 adult Maiasaura that were simultaneously buried. In this entire collection of bones, not a single baby was found. Every one of these 10,000 Maiasaura was between 9 and 23 feet long. Does this seem like the adult dinosaurs were stampeding away from the raging floodwaters, with 100% of their young falling behind? Just 170 miles northeast of this location is one of the largest dinosaur graveyards in the world, one that even secular scientists admit was caused by a watery catastrophe. Here, thousands of centrosaurs are buried in 14 mega bone beds over an entire square mile, which is nearly 500 football fields. Looks like a massive herd of these creatures, thousands of them, were simultaneously buried in mud by Noah's flood. Just 45 miles west from this location is yet another massive flood deposit, and this one even has 49 different species of dinosaurs, buried along with turtles, crocodiles, fish, flying reptiles, birds, and small mammals. What type of disaster could bury nearly 50 species of dinosaurs and many other types of animals, including marine life, together in mass graves? These mass burial sites are common in the US as well. For example, look at this dinosaur dig site in Wyoming, where a 1 meter thick layer of mudstone stretches for 80 acres, with over 1 million bones buried in a graded, sorted bed where big bones are found at the bottom and little bones on top. The only way to develop a graded bed like this is by a catastrophic process that transports these bones and deposits them during a single event. Large flying creatures like pterosaurs were able to fly to escape the rising floodwaters, delaying their demise until the later stages of the flood. The fossil record shows they are buried in many different layers all over the world.
Looking at the fossil record, we can see that ocean life dies in the ocean and land life dies on land. That's how it works. So we would expect to see aquatic life in deep sea layers because they were dying there far before the flood occurred. And until the flood came, which wreaked havoc on life existing at that time, causing dinosaur graveyards and things like that. Remember, when things die on land, they get eaten or degrade rather fast. The odds of life dying to make the quantity of oil that we find on Earth today is best explained by the flood. It's also safe to say that the fossil record is not valid when we find evidence of discrepancies in the record. And guess what? We do. The upside-down geologic column in Pakistan is one such place. At the foot of the Karakoram Mountains in the Salt Range Formation, scientists have discovered fossilized plants and insects. From the evolutionary perspective, these remains belong to the upper part of the geological column. However, this formation lies beneath the Cambrian rock, which is dated back to over 400 million years. Discoveries such as these support the biblical version of the Earth's history, whereby the geological column is primarily a consequence of the global flood and its aftermath. It is no surprise that there is some order to the fossil record, such as sea creatures buried beneath land creatures, and mobile creatures such as birds near the top. But, since as the Salt Range Formation testifies, the ordered charts that adorn textbooks aren't always what they find in the field. Many results today have kicked evolution hard in the dirt. They have found complete stasis in the entire Pliocene era. We also know that the Ashley phosphate beds in North Carolina have found human bones and artifacts with dinosaurs together. Also remember that they also found modern-day birds dating back in the Cambrian rock layers which supposedly evolved from dinosaurs. It's a total mess. Also consider that many of the biggest dinosaurs, such as the long-necked sauropods like the Brachiosaurus, Titanosaurus, and Apatosaurus, would have eaten colossal amounts of vegetation. So why do we not find such abundance of these plants in the rocks containing these dinosaur fossils? Take for example the Morrison Formation in Montana. Even though this formation had yielded many dinosaur fossils, they're very scarce in vegetation. This phenomenon of missing vegetation doesn't just apply to dinosaurs or their rock layers. The Coconino Sandstone in the Grand Canyon has many animal trackways, but it's almost devoid of plants. These rocks tell us something profound about Earth's history. They suggest that these deposits laid down are not ecosystems buried over eons of time. Otherwise, we'd find more evidence as plants that the animals ate. Instead, the evidence fits nicely with the biblical model of early Earth's history, whereas these animals were transported and buried catastrophically during Noah's flood. Geologists have assumed and say that calm weather conditions are required for these settling processes to occur to form mudstone. Therefore, whenever they encounter mud deposits, they interpret them as forming in tranquil water environments. However, recent research published in the prestigious Journal of Science has turned this argument on its head. The researchers showed that mud deposits form from rapidly flowing water. Yet again, evolutionary theory fails when put to the test, and we have more evidence for a global flood.
You find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out?
Noah's flood lines up with brand new scientific research. Over 1,800 oil well boreholes from 4 continents have all been compiled and mapped. The newly emerging map tracks the thickness and extent of each rock type as they were laid down by the flood. This research reveals the same 6 megasequences of sedimentary rock deposits across multiple continents. Each megasequence contains a huge stack of rock, often with coarse-grained sandstone on the bottom, then finer-grained deposits like shale, then topped by limestones. Each megasequence is bounded above and below by flat, eroded surfaces called unconformities. A few places on Earth have layers that represent all 6 megasequences. How did they get there? What do they say about Noah's flood? Catastrophically water-deposited sedimentary layers top most of the world's continents. Would Noah's flood bring lots of water and lots of mud? Geologists agree on the 6 megasequences, but they differ on the timescale in which they happened. If they took millions of years, then they have little to do with the flood, but if they were all deposited rapidly and recently, then the flood should come to mind. Many also question when a larger landmass, such as a Pangea-like supercontinent, broke into continents that moved to their current configuration. For the first time ever, new megasequence maps allow us to see how the flood shaped our entire planet, just like the Bible said, including reconfiguring the continents. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. These 2 events, the fountains of the great deep breaking up and the windows of heaven opening, began the first day of a 371-day-long calamity that resurfaced the earth and killed everything that moved on land. Hot magma mixed with steam pierced the earth's crust. Giant rifts or tears ran thousands of miles across the planet. Scalding hot magma vaporized massive amounts of water that jetted into the atmosphere. The water fell back to Earth as intense global rain, along with torrential rain from heaven for 40 days. Worldwide catastrophic rifting caused massive mud-filled tsunamis to speed across deep ocean floors, then onto shallow ocean floors, killing everything in their path. The first megasequence wipes out mostly shallow marine habitats. The bursting fountains of the great deep spew out megatons of magma and carbon dioxide. Sure enough, the first megasequence rocks show a spike in volcanic activity and massive amounts of carbon dioxide. During these first 40 days, intense water currents overtopped most of the flooded continents. Water-laden sediment travels at highway speeds. Thick sediment blankets start covering low regions of the continent. Fossils show that the first 3 megasequences buried the shallow seas that were filled with marine life, as these deposits have almost no trees or land animals. All 3 megasequences covered similar environments across North and South America and Africa, the 3 continents mapped so far. One global cause, Noah's flood, best explains this one worldwide effect. Then by the 40th day of the flood, the Absorica megasequence began hitting. The maps show that this is when things got much worse. Something shoves the water over the tops of even the high lands from that ancient world. The newly forming ocean floor offshore is so hot that it starts very thick, pushing up the ocean waters from beneath. Sea level rises dramatically. Molten magma rises and fills the widening gaps, pushing the mid-ocean ridges wider. The hot ocean floor shoves against the continents, then slides beneath them like giant conveyor belts, deep beneath the earth in some places. Rather than the conventional model that has the seafloors spreading slowly, this runaway subduction actually happened quickly, moving at about 5 miles per hour due to the heat caused by the friction and pressure of the rapidly subducting plates. As the diving ocean plates subduct under the land, they push down the continental edges and then release them, creating tsunami cycles that blanket the continents, just how tsunamis happen today, only more intense and frequent. For example, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, and the fourth largest in history, was a magnitude 9.1 earthquake that occurred in 2011. This earthquake was caused by an undersea megathrust about 45 miles east of the Japanese coast. At the center, there was a 160-foot slip between the overriding plate that was part of Japan and the underlying Pacific plate. The sea bottom rose about 23 feet when the fault unlocked, and the resulting earthquake triggered a devastating tsunami that was 133 feet above sea level and traveled inland for 6 miles. The tsunamis occurring during the flood, however, were different, much different. With the ocean ridge bursting open rapidly and pushing the ocean floor under land continents on a worldwide scale, tsunamis were happening in cycles, several every hour, and with long stretches of subduction zones active at the same time. The incoming phase of a tsunami has a much higher speed and is highly turbulent, which keeps the sediment in suspension, but it leaves behind layers of sediment as it slows down in the retreating phase. This cycle repeats several times every hour during the 150-day inundation stage of the flood, first entombing the shallow marine life, followed by land creatures in different habitats and elevations, leaving behind what we see today in the fossil record. These types of tsunamis have even occurred in recent history, such as the tsunami caused by slipping ocean plates that hit the coast of Washington in 1700 and left behind multiple layers representing each wave of the tsunami. Recent seismic technology actually allows us to investigate whether this type of rapid subduction occurred. Sure enough, these scans reveal a ring of unexpectedly cold rock at the bottom of the mantle, beneath the subduction zones that surround the Pacific Ocean. The severity and elevation of this stage of the flood is why the first land creatures and plants start showing up in the fossil record laid down by the Absaroka megasequence. Entire ecosystems are buried in enormous deposits that later turn into coal, such as the extensive Appalachian coal beds. In fact, the U.S. has over 7 trillion tons of coal reserves. Where did it all come from? While we know that coal is formed by dead plant material being sandwiched between sediment layers, we only have enough vegetation on the Earth's surface today to produce just a fraction of the existing coal reserves. This shows that the pre-flood world was mostly covered by lush vegetation. The rising floodwaters and tsunamis that were necessary to sweep over the land and bury vast amounts of vegetation that turned into coal are best explained by a catastrophe of worldwide proportions. There's no doubt that widespread volcanism was also involved in finishing off the dinosaurs, as many of these mass graves are literally packed with volcanic ash, ash that in many cases was mixed with water when it emplaced the dinosaurs in their tombs. One section of the Morrison Formation, called the Brushy Basin Member, spreads across 5 states and includes over 4,000 cubic miles of volcanic materials. Without a single volcano in the Morrison Formation, geologists believe this material had to be carried all the way from volcanoes on the west coast, volcanoes created by the magma rising from the subducting ocean crusts plunging under the land. Today, these subduction zones form the Ring of Fire, responsible for over 90% of our earthquakes. The Bible records that on the 150th day of the flood, God made a wind to pass over the earth. The waters started to recede. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Now enters the final mega-sequence, the Tejas. Here, after the water peaked over the top of the highest remnant of the pre-flood world, it began to rush off the continents, eroding and reworking some of the deposits laid down in the previous mega-sequences, especially carving away at the Zuni deposits. This final sequence appears to have been different than the others because there was a reversal in flow direction as the waters began to sheet off the continents. This flow reversal transported much of the fossils deposited earlier off the highest uplands, spreading them towards the edges of the continent. The evidence points to the Tejas draining the floodwaters southward off of the U.S. towards the Gulf of Mexico with a sheet wash pattern all at once. This is why we find massive sand deposits in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. Billions of barrels of oil have been discovered there, with much of it found within a massive 1,100-foot thick bed of pure sand in over 7,000 feet of water, over 200 miles offshore. In addition, plants swept off the pre-flood lands formed massive coal beds, such as in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana. These Tejas layers contain the largest coal deposits in North America that currently supplies over 40% of the coal in the U.S. Some of these stacked coal beds are up to 200 feet thick and cover areas that are 60 miles long by 60 miles wide. The sheer volume of plant material required to form such a massive layer of coal testifies to catastrophic circumstances. The massive runoff that began with the Tejas may also explain the lack of human fossils in the rock record. Any residual human remains left buried in earlier deposits were totally destroyed by the erosive, retreating floodwaters. In line with God's promise to wipe them from the face of the earth, any residual remains were ground up and likely spread in all directions over great distances by the Tejas, lessening the likelihood of finding any human fossil remains. Because humans were impacted earlier by the flood's violence, they were destroyed and thus not buried whole deep in the sediments, leaving no fossil traces. Erosion in the Tejas sequence would have affected the strata beneath, wiping away even traces of human remains buried in earlier layers. When God stopped the fountains of the Great Deep on day 150, the new ocean surface began cooling and sinking, allowing the floodwaters to lower as they sheeted off the continents into the new ocean basins. Psalm 104 describes the mountains being raised at the end of the flood, and the waters draining down valleys and off the emerging new land surfaces. The seafloor rifting process and the resulting mountain forming process explains why sea creatures are found on mountaintops all over the world, high above current sea levels. For the remaining 220 days of the flood, the water recedes from the earth and it dries out, allowing time for earth to be replenished with vegetation for the animals to eat when they eventually come off the ark. This year-long catastrophe left behind a vast number of proofs that, quite frankly, make its occurrence obvious. First, we have the staggering volume of fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks around the world. Over 1 mile thick on average, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And the sediment they're found in lies above sea level. What sort of water process could emplace so much sediment above sea level on top of the land surface? Another clue is the vast horizontal extent of individual sediment layers with little to no erosional channeling between successive layers. What sort of transport and depositional process could conceivably generate such uniform layers over such vast horizontal distances? Many of these layered beds are separated by bedding planes on the scale of inches to feet, a feature so common that few stop to think about how it happened. It's as if the sediment is being deposited in pulses in a repeating manner, with each pulse producing a thin layer commonly found around the world. The flood tsunamis provide a perfect explanation, and it happened so quickly that there was no time between deposition of the layers for surviving critters to burrow into the layers and churn them over. What has been discovered, both from a creationist as well as from a secular understanding, is that much of the continental fossil record was already in place before any of the present-day ocean crust had come into existence at a rift zone. For example, all of the trilobite fossils had been deposited, plus all of the older coal deposits had already been formed before any of the present-day ocean crust had formed. Since in creationist understanding, the presence of fossils is a completely trustworthy indicator of the action of the flood, this means that much of the flood cataclysm had already unfolded and had generated fossil-bearing sediments on the continental surface before any of the present-day ocean floor had appeared. It further implies that all of today's ocean floor formed since the onset of the flood, during roughly the latter half of the cataclysm. It also means that all of the pre-flood ocean floor, plus the ocean floor formed during the earlier portion of the flood, must have been recycled into the Earth's interior during the cataclysm. These considerations indicate in a compelling way that rapid plate tectonics must have been a major aspect of the year-long flood catastrophe. This 6 megasequence worldwide flooding process perfectly set the stage for the subsequent ice age. The oceans had been tremendously heated by the rifting that had taken place across the 45,000-mile ridge system, and the creation of a completely new seafloor of hot lava as a consequence. This caused an abnormal amount of evaporation, and thus continuous rain that was likely worldwide. The volcanic activity created by the subduction zones that created the Ring of Fire would have spewed volumes of ash and aerosols high into the atmosphere, resulting in cooling, especially in the higher latitudes. These factors combined to produce an ice age that lasted a few hundred years, but ended as the conditions that caused it waned.
This is possibly one of the most profound evidences that man lived with dinosaurs on the Earth. This is a sauropod dinosaur depicted by Native Americans in Utah. This is the wishful thinking of the evolutionists. Oh, they're so badly depicted. Is that accurate? I would say that's accurate. Is that accurate? Yeah, that's accurate. Is this accurate? Could there be anything less accurate? I mean, we see cartoons of dinosaurs on TV for kids every day that look less accurate than that. It's nobody, and I mean nobody, would look at this picture and not know that that is a sauropod dinosaur. You could show that picture to a 3-year-old and they would say, dinosaur, because obviously it's a dinosaur. Now, to believe that people depicted these creatures and then, which are accurate reproductions of creatures that actually did exist in the past and think they got it right by chance is not believable. Unless these are dinosaurs, there is no creature on the earth that's looked like these. Never.
People like Bill Nye here state specifically, you never find a higher modern-day animal mixed in with a lower animal in the fossil record. Well, he is outright wrong, because he, like most people, have never heard of the Ashley phosphate beds of South Carolina, which is a shame, because it is the best piece of evidence to ever exist currently that man has lived alongside of dinosaurs, without question. The Ashley phosphate bed is the largest graveyard ever found. This information has been forgotten by the sands of time, but I am going to bring it back. Today, the Ashley phosphate bed is mined for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer, so there is great money to be made. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and extending into Florida all the way up into Canada. World-famous geologist at the time, Louis Agassiz, described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds are so full of bones that it is believed by scientists that the phosphate itself is made from bone. So, if the Ashley phosphate bed is loaded with such an incredible amount of fossils as to cause the leading geologist and zoologist of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, you should ask yourself, why has zero mention of this ever been brought up? The fossils completely ravage the evolutionary timeline. That's why. Remember, if the geologic column is out of place, even in one area on Earth, then it falsifies the theory of evolution, and that the layers form slowly and that they represent time. Well, when you look at this one place where there's an 18-inch thick layer, you will see why it's suppressed. In it are rare fossils of everything from whales and porpoises, fish, sharks, megalodon shark, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, camels, elephants, mammoth, mastodon, rhinoceroses, giant sloth, muskrats, deer, pig, dogs, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, plesiosauruses, ichthyosaurs, and human bones, teeth, and artifacts, all within the same layer. Professor S.F. Holmes, the paleontologist and curator of the College of Charleston's National History Museum, described the fossil graveyard in a report to the Academy of Natural Sciences. He stated, "Remains of the hog, the horse, and other animals of recent date, together with human bones mingled in with the bones of mastodon and extinct giant lizards." And this is on record. The occurrence of a hadrosaur dinosaur remains in the Ashley phosphate beds has not been dealt with in the secular science literature really at all. Only 2 sources exist. They have kept it silent, which is typical. The sad part is, when they first uncovered the relics of the human bone, they immediately became afraid. They, without hesitation, considered their jobs to be at a loss, so they said that the bone was out of place to one another. They immediately threw it in the river to be erased from history and hidden from all view. They knew that such a find would cause them to either probably lose their jobs or their grant funding. And this is all the way back in the late 1800s. They were still in fear of the government from evolutionary dogma, as Darwin's theory had now taken hold. The scientists who studied this knew exactly what they had found. This is why their deep concern for finding such anomalies. Professor of Geology and Paleontology F.S. Holmes believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence. So he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff. Immediately in contact with the surface of the stormy stratum, we pulled it out and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned an accidental occupant of quarters to which had no right, geologically. And so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year later, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." After the news became public, I guess Holmes saw no reasons to cower from his discovery anymore, as Holmes portrayed a dinosaur with a man on the cover of his own book. Evolutionists have admitted that if dinosaurs are ever found with humans, then they would admit that the Noah's flood was real and that man did live alongside of dinosaurs, and that the biblical timeline is true. Because this evidence would validate that the Earth is young and that they had been lied to about our ancient history, there is no rescuing device for them either, because the Ashley phosphate beds had no layers to them. All of the fossils are mixed together in one huge pool of bones, 18 inches thick, covering 200 miles, with no layers found anywhere. The experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds have said that there are no layers, and not even a remote resemblance of a layer. It is all one graveyard.
Peter Bilmer also wrote in on Facebook, "Apropos science educators or people who pretend to be one. A creepy YouTube atheist claims that a geological formation known as the Ashley phosphate beds is composed of invisible layers, proving deep time. Can you address that claim? Is that because every evidence for evolutionism is in fact invisible and has to be imagined?" Well, thanks for writing in, Peter. The Ashley phosphate beds are a layer of sediments which are being mined today for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and quite probably extending into Florida and up into Canada. The world-famous geologist Louis Agassiz described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds have so many fossil bones in them that it's believed the phosphate itself is from bones. So, if the Ashley phosphate beds are so loaded with such incredible fossils as to cause one of the leading geologists and zoologists of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, why then has virtually zero been written about the fossils in the scientific literature? When you look at what was written in the 1800s, you'll probably quickly deduce why. The fossils completely ravage the evolutionary timeline. In that 18-inch thick layer, there has been found together the bones of, whales, porpoises, fish, sharks, and ray sharks, including the gigantic shark Megalodon, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, tapirs, camels, elephants, rhinoceroses, mammoths and mastodons, sloths, muskrats, deer, pigs, dogs, sheep, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, what are commonly called marine dinosaurs like the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and yes, human bones, teeth, and artifacts. That's right, dinosaurs, mammoths, marine reptiles from the alleged dinosaur period, and humans, all found in the same layer. As many leading evolutionists have acknowledged, if humans and dinosaurs were found together, it would demonstrate that the Earth was young. It would refute the millions of years and would refute evolution. Creation would be vindicated. So how does this atheist answer this powerful evidence, refuting evolution and affirming a young Earth and creation? By claiming that there are layers to the Ashley phosphate beds, and that the marine dinosaurs, the mammoths, and the human fossils are actually separated into these individual layers. You just can't see the layers. Invisible layers. Good explanation. This bizarre explanation gets even weirder when you consider the layer average is a whopping 18 inches thick. That's a lot of invisible layers compressed into 1.5 feet of sediments. And this would also mean that the scientists who have studied it were completely blind to these layers, which is ridiculous, seeing as how they'd studied layers elsewhere and this layer was only 18 inches thick. Professor of Geology and Paleontology, F.S. Holmes, believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence, so he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship, and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff, immediately in contact with the surface of the stony stratum, the phosphate rocks. We pulled it out, and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned as an accidental occupant of quarters to which it had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year after, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." In fact, Holmes even portrayed a dinosaur and a human on the cover of his book. The only people claiming invisible layers is creepy internet atheists. Others, like Holmes, have at least tried to explain the way the fossils found together as perhaps fossils that were worked out of older and younger rocks to be washed together. Now, this theory also just plain doesn't work, and I don't have time to get into explaining that today, but it shows you that these experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds obviously didn't think there was multiple layers there, contrary to the ignoramuses on YouTube. You can read more on the Ashley phosphate beds in the book written by the late geologist John Watson, Man, Dinosaurs and Mammals Together, available at the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum.
A statement from the book says, "Since remains of land animals and sea animals were found together, a catastrophic event would have included the burial of enormous numbers of animals, and their subsequent conversion into the rock phosphate over a region of at least 200 miles by 30 miles in extent, which is only partially exposed apart. Such an event is of the order and magnitude of the worldwide Noetic flood."
You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one.
So we can continue to listen to Bill here, or an actual scientist in the field.
Living fossils is just one of 4 simultaneous experiments that I carried out to test evolution. It was based on a simple prediction that if evolution was not true, and if animals did not change over time, I should be able to find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found. First, I found a fossil shrimp in a dinosaur rock layer that looked very similar to a modern appearing Gulf shrimp. Then I found a crayfish in a dinosaur layer that looked like a modern crayfish. Then a crab, then a prawn, then a lobster. Soon I realized I had found all of the major crustacean groups in the dinosaur rock layers. Then I turned my attention to the insects. First, I found a modern appearing dragonfly that was found in a dinosaur rock layer. Then a katydid, then a cockroach, then a cricket, and soon I had representatives of all of the major insect groups living today from the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Then I had representatives of all the shellfish groups, the echinoderm groups, etc. And soon I realized that I had representatives of all of the major invertebrate phyla living today. I'd found these in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Next, I turned my attention to the vertebrates, and here I ran into problems. Museums were, for the most part, not displaying the most important vertebrate fossils. They were kept out of the view of the public. So I turned to the literature and began interviewing scientists, asking if they had seen any modern appearing vertebrates with the dinosaurs. And lo and behold, they had. Dr. Clemens reported finding a modern appearing parrot in a dinosaur rock layer. Others reported finding ducks, loons, flamingos with dinosaurs. This was utterly amazing. And others reported finding shrew-like animals, squirrel-like animals, platypus-like mammals, and other mammals in the dinosaur rock layers. Now, I did not find any of the larger mammals in the dinosaur rock layers, but this could just as easily be explained by a misinterpretation of the geological layers. Lastly, I turned my attention to the plants, and once again, I found representatives of all of the major plant divisions living today in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Sequoias with dinosaurs, oak trees with dinosaurs, magnolias, dogwoods, etc. It was amazing. In summary, I predicted that if evolution was not true, I would find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found.
What we want in science is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. And the big thing I want from you is, can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature?
Bill Nye is nothing but a globalist tool, a propaganda outlet. Remember, this dude is nothing but a public face posing as an extraordinary scientist in every field, used to indoctrinate kids, who even says that this was his target audience. But the fact is, his PhD is in engineering. He not only doesn't know a single current young Earth creationist prediction, but cannot name any prediction that has been made in the field. That is how biased and blind he is to the very opposition he is arguing against. And I know for a fact he doesn't, because he just asked Ken if he could even name one prediction for him.
We've already given a number of predictions, some based on flood geology and catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, we can look to numerous retrodictions, consistencies with the Bible, a literal interpretation of Genesis. The Bible tells us that it is the history book of the universe. Therefore, let's look at what it tells us and see if we can make accurate retrodictions based on that. Now, there's evidence that refutes evolution and confirms the Bible all at the same time. It's a double whammy. All human beings are profoundly similar genetically, and this points directly to Adam and Eve. Think about it. The Bible tells us that we all descend from just two people, Adam and Eve. Now, if we only started with two people, what does that do? Well, it restricts the diversity today. Now, over deep time, as the evolutionists look to, any substantially large population will undoubtedly accumulate enormous numbers of mutations. And what this results in is enormous amounts of genetic diversity. And this is a fatal problem for evolutionary theory, because it is now absolutely clear that mankind has very limited genetic variation. In a clip that has been shown, Bill Nye admits this to Ken Ham when he brings up the Human Genome Project, and that we're all incredibly similar. But while the observed low genetic diversity is a massive problem from the evolutionary perspective, this is most certainly expected and predicted from the biblical perspective, because from the biblical model, we all come from just two people. This obviously means that limited diversity is easy to explain. It's expected. The Bible predicted this. This means the death and demise of the evolutionary bottleneck theory and the evolutionary out of Africa theory. It doesn't just end there. I mean, it's now clear and evident that there exists a singular female ancestor of all human beings. She's referred to as mitochondrial Eve. Her basic DNA sequence is easily discernible and detected in humans alive today. And it's not more similar to a chimpanzee. Same thing goes for Adam. His DNA sequence is largely known as well. And contrary to what evolutionists believe, it's not at all similar to that of chimpanzees. You can look to Y chromosome Adam for this. We see 3 major haplogroups. We can look to Noah's flood. This story tells us that all people should be closely related. It tells us there should only be a few mitochondrial DNA lines as Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wife, and only one Y chromosome, since it's only Noah. His 3 sons would have inherited his Y chromosome, of course. And we should have significant evidence of rapid population growth. It turns out that this, too, is exactly what we find in modern genetics. And what's funny is this did not have to be true. The Bible tells us that it is the history book of the universe. We have evidence after evidence after evidence. Predictions are being made based on this mitochondrial DNA map of humanity. You can look to Dr. Nathaniel Jensen and his work found in replacing Darwin for this. You can look at this tree that has been, it's several 100 human individuals, and the tips on this tree, these branches, represent human individuals, and the distance of the lines, they're very long lines, would be lots of DNA differences, and the short lines would be almost none at all. If you look at the tree and what you might notice, this tree represents various people groups around the globe. Many of these lines come together as 3 major nodes, exactly what we'd expect and predict based on the biblical base model. This is a fact that evolutionists even acknowledge, the 3 major haplogroups. Now, the fact that there's 3 major groupings and subgroupings, we can make predictions. Now, for example, the history of humanity, it's in our genome. We can see the echo of civilization here. And there are many, many lines of evidence that point us directly to
Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature?
Because that's what real science does, implying that creationism doesn't have any falsifiable predictions, thus not real science. Now, I know that a PhD is not a prerequisite to be called a scientist or to develop expertise in any subject, obviously, but Bill Nye is not an expert in climate science, yet he talks about the subject like he is and tells others that he is. And from watching him with Ken Ham, he also claims to know creation science doesn't use applicable forms of the scientific methods. Yet, he doesn't even know anything about our models, nor what type of science methods we use. He was even stumped when Ken Ham brought up the Human Genome Project that showed that all humans were 99% genetically related. The fact is, if Bill really wanted to know the truth, rather than just walk through the ark with TV cameras following him, he would have actually talked to one of the creation scientists, and not an actual preacher. Rather, he would have investigated and learned our side of the argument. The fact that he doesn't know any of this shows his absolute bias against it, but it's not a shock to me at all, really. He, like other atheists like himself, call creationists the ignorant ones. How pathetic. He is like most angry atheists today, offended by others who think differently than the way he does. He's like a lot of atheists who witch hunt today against intelligent designers or creationists, rather than actually look at the science they use and see how far superior it is to their dogmatic belief of evolutionism, built on nothing but assumption.
You and I are descendants of Martians.
Okay,
That
and
is
that's
not crazy.
And that's not crazy? You're saying we're descendants of Martians, and that's not crazy?
I say it is not crazy. It's extraordinary, but not crazy.
Okay,
and
so
we have a process
so
by which we can prove that.
That's what's so exciting. Prove that we're just... Bill, I want you to do that for all these young people. prove that we're descendants from Martians?
I can't prove that right now.
Is it crazy that you and I are descendants of Adam and Eve?
We are descendants from a common ancestor. I don't
But
know
is
that
it
they went
crazy
by
that
those names.
is it crazy that God made the first man and woman and we're descendants of them?
For me, there's no evidence of that.
When we read the Bible, it states that God took Adam's rib to make Eve, and from them spread all humanity. Normal humans have 46 chromosomes in each cell, divided into 23 pairs, with 2 copies of chromosome 2. Since Adam's DNA was created with these 2 original chromosomes 2 in the Y chromosome, for which every normal man has, and that Y chromosome gets passed on to all future males, then it becomes easy to trace the Y chromosome back in history. The sons of these sons have the same Y chromosome as their paternal grandfather, and so on. For this reason, all male offspring from one man have the same Y chromosome. We follow that all the way back to a single point of origin, and we find our answer if creation is true or if evolution is true. The evidence tells us that a single male ancestor, Adam, was the father of all men because there was only one man alive to pass on his Y chromosome to the world population of males. If evolution were true, and there were many male ancestors to all of humanity, then there would be a huge genetic diversity and far more than a single Y chromosome parent of mankind. What does the evidence show? We do only see one Y chromosome, with 2 chromosome 2s from Adam and no other. Therefore, genetics proves creation as well, as it places a tremendous limit on the amount of genetic diversity we see in the world today. Since that is what we see, not only does it verify creation from a single male ancestor, but it validates biblical account, and there being only one paternal line going all the way back to Adam, with no other males alive, contrary to the evolutionary theory. Also, all humans came from a single female. I don't think people consider this fact very much. Let's just take a look at that last comment that I made about all humans being from a single female. What are the odds of this? If a secular evolutionist even considered this for just a moment, rather than shrugging it off with excuses like there must have been a bottleneck, or there were probably many other women alive and those women didn't have kids, or maybe all of them just had boys, completely non-logical, especially when I describe the scenario for you in a minute. Besides, even according to their own theory, they have no proof of any bottleneck occurring, not in paleontology, the fossil record, or geology, in the geological column. So, what evidence do we have for this belief of a bottleneck? They don't have anything for it. That's your answer. A failed hypothesis is all that they have. You see, this is the real problem. According to the evolution theory, about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, there were about 10,000 to 30,000 individuals. That's an estimate. Now let's just say half were women. That leaves us with 5,000 or 15,000, whatever you want to go with. Let's just say that the average is 10,000 for this debate. So now we have 10,000 different lines of possible mitochondrial DNA to be passed down. Yet we only have one today. What are the odds of this? That's highly improbable. But if you start with the biblical account, this lines up perfectly as to what we would expect and what we do see. There should be just one line, and there is just one line, exactly what the empirical evidence shows. Vast correlations line up directly with what the Bible says, and this is undeniable evidence.
So what's the difference between science and observational science?
Stabbed yourself in the foot on this one, buddy, because creation science uses observational rates down the line. No assumption required. We have been genetically deteriorating since the fall of Adam, because sin brought death into the world, and rapid disease increase is evident, just like the Bible describes. Genomic decay is evident. We can see it not only in man, but even of the beast of the world. And we can show, with the empirical evidence, that there is a fast-ticking mitochondrial clock, in not just man, but all life on Earth. As where evolution only uses bias assumption based on their own molecular clock invention, which has been calibrated by only using their fossil record inference, not observable, testable, falsifiable predictions. As you can see, when someone says creationism isn't real science, they have no idea what they're talking about. It's far superior science than the biased, assumption-based field evolutionary science taught today. Take, for example, the best way of measuring mutations is using observable, testable, repeatable evidence to calculate. Wouldn't you agree? Well, we creationists take a family tree and say it's been this many generations since the Y chromosome has been separated from its parent common ancestor. We then count up the mutations between them and divide them by the number of generations. Easy. When you do this, you get a very high mutation rate, just like the empirical evidence shows. Most mutations rate calculate anywhere between 64 and 200 new mutations every generation. So you have more mutations than your parents, and they have more mutations than their parents, and so on. This is where the difference comes from. You see, as creationists, we use the observable rates, used in the genealogical method, as where evolutionists use their phylogenetic method, based off nothing but pure assumption. First, they assume common ancestry to be true, so they immediately add on an imagined, unknown, unfound chimp ancestor. Then they will take these two genes that are shared between the human and chimps, and they'll count out the number of differences and divide them by 6.5 million years, another assumption. The number of years that they assume the human split between the missing chimp ancestor. And that number gives you a very small mutation rate number. So they assume long-scale evolution already to be true, then they assume a missing link common ancestor, then they assume a split occurred between us and them. All storytelling bias assumptions involved. The observable evidence lines up with creation, not evolution, and not even close. And this is what you will see down the line. They do the same thing to mitochondrial clocks, which I showed you before this, tossing out the actual observable rates tested, seen in the lab. Totally biased and unscientific.
You know what's interesting? When the Human Genome Project mapped the human genome, they said there's only one race of people. You know what that confirms? The Bible. Because we all go back to Adam and Eve, we're all one race.
So I don't think it confirms the Bible. It just makes the Bible consistent with nature on this one point. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed?
When it comes to the ice core layers, we actually found what's called the Lost Squadron. And the Lost Squadron were a plane that were lost during World War II. And when a very rich man wanted to come along and he wanted to buy those planes and he put them on his property or start a museum, not really sure which one he wanted to do. He wanted to go find these planes. So he spent a lot of money and he went out there and he assumed that, he would just see the planes, but he couldn't. And they were actually so far down that when they actually dug down, they found them, which would have been an equivalent of 135,000 years, because the layers weren't laid down every year. They were laid down by cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot. So the prediction of ice core layers, when they see those strata, which look like they're annual, are actually just dependent on the day or the season, and they can fluctuate and change.
Top 5 reasons as to why creationism is an assault on science. Well, you deny your critical thinking skills. It's completely unreasonable. They're pyramids 5,000 years old, for crying out loud.
First of all, radio halo dating in coal is closest to the conventional dating method. Way back in the 70s, Dr. Robert Gentry pointed to radio halos in coal from the Triassic, Jurassic, and Eocene rock layers. In evolutionary years, those layers are alleged to be 37 to 245 million years old. Wood was laid down and infiltrated with uranium. The uranium, as it broke down radioactively, left behind a sphere of radiation damage called a radiohalo around the lump of uranium. The wood was then compressed by tectonic upheaval into coal, and the spheres of radiation damage were compressed as well into flattened spheres. The uranium kept decaying and made a new sphere of radiation damage. Each alpha particle emitted from the uranium travels through the coal, damaging the coal. They radiate out in all directions, but they all end at the same distance because of the level of energy emission. So eventually enough particles are emitted to form these spheres of damage around the lump of uranium. The problem was that the amount of particles emitted since the compression event was only a few thousand years worth of radioactivity. And all of the coal samples had these flattened radiohalos within the same time frame. So what does that mean? It means that the 37 million evolutionary years to 245 million evolutionary years were all compressed into one event and one time frame only several thousand years ago. That's right, not even 10,000 years ago. But let us not forget the rate team's helium diffusion dating method. Uranium and zircon crystals embedded in granite basement rocks, dated over 2 billion evolutionary years old, gives off helium as it decays. The helium, being such a small gas molecule, leaks out of the crystal very fast, while the uranium that's producing it is a very slow rate. The rate team then made two predictions for the leakage rate. One based on the evolutionary age of the rock, and one based on the rock actually being 6,000 years old. When the actual lab work was performed, it wound up squarely on the 6,000 year age. This was basement rock, the foundational rock of the continents, now dated to 6,000 years old. Now, there's more ways we can deduce the young age of the Earth, but that's just two examples, and I'll have to do because we're out of time.
Bill Nye and other evolutionists like to make this claim that there's never been a fossil found outside of the predicted layer of the geologic column. Well, this simply isn't true, and they also make the claim that coal was formed 250 million years ago. Well, we can debunk both of these ideas just by looking at a couple of discoveries that we've made. For instance, we found an iron hammer that was surrounded by seashells inside of its layer. They took those seashells and they dated them according to their radiometric dating, and they dated at 400 million years old. How's that possible if we found a man-made hammer inside of them? It's also interesting to note that part of the handle of that hammer turned to coal. Newton Anderson found a bell inside of a lump of coal in 1994. We found a man-made gold chain inside of a lump of coal. We found a cast iron pot inside of a lump of coal. If coal was formed 250 million years ago, then how are we finding all these man-made tools inside of them? We found some sort of vessel that was made of silver and zinc that was in a rock that was supposedly 600 million years old. That was in Massachusetts in 1851. We found a clay doll inside of a rock layer that was supposedly 12 million years old. That was discovered by a well driller. I mean, the list goes on and on. There are also a large number of failed evolutionary predictions. For instance, vestigial structures. They used to think that there were all these parts of the human body that didn't serve any sort of function, and they called them vestigial structures, and they used to claim that there were hundreds of these throughout the human body. But the more we learned about the human body, the more we realized that there are no parts of it that don't serve a function. In fact, the only possible vestigial structure left would be the male nipple, and that might serve a purpose that we just aren't aware of. So the reality of the situation is, if you're making all these, thousands of predictions, you're liable to get a couple of them right.
Evolution is the fundamental idea in biology. So you're not going to have a next generation of physicians or people to research vaccines without an understanding of evolution.
He brings up evolution theory when he meant to bring up cell theory. He doesn't even know the difference. Do you want to know what evolution theory has actually brought to medicine? The removal of the gallbladder, thinking that it was worthless and harmful to have. The removal of these vital organs that actually serve a purpose, and they're not vestigial remnants left over. So, let me be clear. Evolutionary theory has caused the death and suffering of an innumerable amount of people. When evolution indoctrinated scientists failed to discover the purpose for which the appendix was created, for example, their indoctrination led them to illogically conclude that it had little to no physiological function, that it was just an evolutionary leftover, a vestigial organ. Thus began the unnecessary removal of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people's appendixes, as they spread this evolutionary concept to doctors. Now we've learned the valuable immunological role of the appendix. Little did they know back then that it was a backup immune system which produces killer B cells, like the thyroid produces killer T cells. It also plays a replenishing healthy gut bacteria role after sickness, especially after diarrhea. But how many people suffered infections, chronic health problems, and death from compromised immune systems due to this loss of bacteria, vital to our body's defense system, all because of evolutionary dogma? We will never truly know the negative impact, but the numbers are off the charts. Evolution causes far more harm than good. So, Bill Nye, the science guy, you're obviously not the science guy you claim to be, because you don't even have the basic understanding of the difference of theories. First of all, no, it's cell theory. That is the bedrock of biology. Emergence is the universal theme of biology. Evolution is just an extension of that. Just like how any field would branch out, some become dilapidated, useless twigs whose development doesn't benefit anyone. The bedrock of medicine is the germ theory of disease, which is an extension of cell theory, not evolution theory. It is an understanding of the methods of treatment of disease, with a fluid understanding of pathophysiology, anatomy, and internal medicine. This is my specialty and I write books on it. You have either such a lack of understanding in this area, or you're completely lying about it. You will never see a patient get cured by understanding that they're an ape, or related to a chimpanzee, or whatever you want to scrounge up in the fossil record and say we're related to. That nonsense doesn't belong in biology, where actual observable, testable evidence matters. Just like how it's a doctor's job to treat a patient, it's a biologist's job to use his understanding of cellular life to somehow benefit humanity. What does evolutionary theory have to do with this? Nothing. What does a fossil benefit? How does a society further improve by continuously digging up useless fossils and putting them in museums? When a patient is dying, what are you going to do? Shovel interpretational evidence down their throat? Understanding evolution is only relevant in a few niche fields, and it really just boils down to an understanding of the applicable mechanisms of Mendelian genetics, which was discovered before evolution ever became popularized. Antibiotic resistance takes a paragraph for me to explain, and doesn't require a course in phylogenetics. Are these objectable true facts? Yes. But you don't seem to care. You just care that evolution is true, because you need it to be true. Your job and income rely on it. The concept of evolutionary theory in the minds of children is destructive. It causes more kids to become atheists than any other theory on Earth. And atheists lead the world in depression, medication intake, suicide, and school shootings. Good job, Bill Nye.
Can you repeat it? I'm sorry.
They said, if Darwin's title of The Origin of Species is it racist?
Yeah, of course it's racist.
Gotcha.
Well, how about rubidium and strontium? You want to start there? What we have found through chemistry is that certain radioactive elements will substitute in certain non-radioactive elements in certain rock crystals. So when they do that, you can measure how many of these radioactive atoms got inserted in the crystal, and so you can determine the age of the rocks. And it's not 6,000 years, it's 4.5 billion.
Nearly every textbook and science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot. But let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life, that is, the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore it cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
Scientific value being stronger evidence than everything you can observe around you in nature is really an extraordinary claim.
There is one thing that is not shared among people: deletions. You see, God made us a great design, a backup of our genome. If one of ours, say from our father's side, breaks, our mother's side will keep us alive. One of you listening to me right now is missing over 1 million base pairs of DNA from your genome in different pieces that have been deleted throughout time. Interestingly though, these deletions are not shared among populations because they break or decay at random. Most of the diversity is shared among populations, but diversity of the deletions are not, meaning 1, there are new errors, 2, they are post-Babel, and 3, meaning the human genome is falling apart. Genetic entropy is an observable fact. Here's a study that analyzed 20 human genomes. They concluded, we summarized different categories of variation in each genome. in a total across all 20 of the genomes, finding a surprising number of variant predictions to reduce or remove the proteins encoded by different genes. So, we even have more evidence that people today are missing genes. In fact, surprising for evolutionary believing scientists, you're not supposed to delete information over time. You're supposed to evolve new information over time and preserve it. But what we see is different things falling out of the genome and rapidly. Dr. John Sanford predicted the extinction of the human race after 350 generations. Right now, we are at 300 since the time of Adam. He predicted this over a decade ago. And with more new studies recently being done using trio methods, the prediction that he had made is more clear than ever. There is a continuous buildup of mutations that are constantly adding up in the genome and decaying it. This proves a few things. One, if mutations and selection cannot preserve the information already within the genome, then how could it have already created the information in the first place? Two, the constant buildup of near-neutral mutations are constant. Now that this is proven, it is easy to trace this back in time using the observable rate, where we end up with a time of 0 mutations, which would have been Adam, and it happens to land exactly as predicted by young Earth creationism at almost 6,000 years ago. 3. Even modern-day secular scientists agree with this, and they see the problem, a rise in disease attributed to what they thought and believed were neutral mutations. So, besides the observable mutation rate to use as a clock, we also have a fast-ticking mitochondrial clocks, which also prove young Earth creationism. Dr. Jensen has used this fast-ticking mitochondrial region in his prediction called the transatlantic slave trade mutation rate of the Khoisan people. The results of this come out soon. However, using these rates already, which have been validated, this again proves young Earth creationism by showing that just 6,000 years ago, the clock started. Even studying human genetic diversity, the numbers land exactly with what young Earth creationism would predict, and not even close to evolutionary predictions. Multiple secular studies have validated a fast-ticking mitochondrial clock. Even tracing the Y chromosome back in time proves again young Earth creationism. Time and time again, the observable rates prove young Earth creationism and invalidate evolution. The only way evolution passes as real science today is by using mathematical assumptions into the equation. If it is removed, evolution truly has nothing. The observable rates prove the truth. The lies of evolution will not go unnoticed on our channel. Evolution has lied long enough to the public, and it's time for it to be exposed for the fraud that it truly is.
But by the way, you wouldn't have televisions without science.
So then you're saying
there
that
are things that I accept as true that are not.
That are not true.
Let me ask you a question. Does the fact that fewer people are believing in evolution suggest that maybe we aren't evolving?
Oh.
See, that's why Sam's
I think the pendulum will swing.
Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Are we different to the animals?
Yes, you can run this test too.
Yeah, so we're different.
Yeah.
So,
well, no. We're exactly the same in every possible way.
are we different to the animals?
Yes.
No. We're exactly the same in every possible way.
You can find almost anything if you look in the fossil record that resembles something else. That means nothing. Paleontologist Lawrence Whitmer of Ohio University, in a commentary, stated, "Perhaps the time has come to finally accept that Archaeopteryx was just another small, feathered, bird-like theropod fluttering around in the Jurassic. What do evolutionists say about fully modern birds found in the early strata before Archaeopteryx supposedly evolved these fused fingers together? You guessed it, nothing. Stephen Jay Gould, said, "It's a curious mosaic, not a transitional fossil." Even the stinkbird, alive today, is a species of tropical bird found in swamps, forests, and mangroves in the Amazon and in South America. It is notable for having chicks that possess claws. The truth? Hand claws are actually widespread in modern birds, and not all that unusual. Ornithologists say Archaeopteryx is a bird, as where paleontologists say it's a dinosaur. Not even a consensus between the sciences. The new rave in evolutionism is that birds are just dinosaurs and that dinosaurs evolved into birds. There is a joke that KFC should change its name to KFD, Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. But not all of evolutionary scientists accept this nonsense. A proponent is one renowned ornithologist, Alan Feducci of the University of North Carolina. He recently stated, "The theory that birds are the equivalent of living dinosaurs and that dinosaurs were feathered is full of holes, so much so that creationists have jumped all over it." He further laments, "With the advent of feathered dinosaurs, we are truly witnessing the beginning of the meltdown of the field of paleontology. Those looking for evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs will be disappointed, because the Creator told us that He created birds before land animals, such as dinosaurs." In 1994, the esteemed journal Science shocked the scientific world by publishing sequence data from DNA retrieved from dinosaur bone thought to be 80 million years old. DNA is a fragile molecule, and so it breaks down quickly. Measurements of DNA stability suggest that it could only last thousands of years, at best, only under perfect conditions. But 80 million years was just too incredible for skeptical scientists. Eventually, these skeptics were vindicated, as it became apparent that the original researchers had sequenced contaminated human DNA, not dinosaur DNA. However, in 2012, a different group of researchers published new results supporting the discovery of actual dinosaur DNA. These new results eventually became impossible to disprove or avoid, with the researchers applying multiple checks against contamination from non-dinosaur sources. The preservation of dinosaur DNA doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective, but it fits the biblical history whereby dinosaurs lived thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago. Evolutionists have to invoke rescuing devices to get around these problems, like usual. How do you think our view of dinosaurs would change if everyone knew scientists found carbon-14 in their bones? Well, a group of geophysicists have discovered exactly that, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. This is indeed a shocking proposal for those who believe that the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago, because carbon-14 decays so fast that it could not possibly survive that long. There should be not one atom of carbon-14 present in dinosaur bones if they are really as old as they claim to be. After going to great lengths to rule out contamination, the researchers concluded that they had indeed found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. These results seriously undermine the evolutionary story of long ages in Earth's history. However, they fit nicely with the biblical history, where dinosaurs lived only thousands of years ago. In the early 90s, researchers from Montana State University made an amazing discovery. Inspecting a piece of T-Rex bone under a microscope, they could hardly believe their eyes. They could see dinosaur red blood cells. This discovery prompted lead scientist Mary Schweitzer to say, "It is exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it." I said to the lab technician, "The bones after all are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long?" In the A Discover magazine article, Dr. Schweitzer explained further her response. "If you take blood cell samples and you stick them on the shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week. Why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? Well, the only reason there would be anything left in dinosaurs comes down to there being iron in the blood. However, this excuse falls short, as you are about to see. But first, let's touch on two other reasons that this cannot happen. As I am explaining these two other major problems with why dinosaur bones cannot be 65 million years old, look at all the findings of soft tissue discovered recently and how they know to look for it now, rather than just assume it doesn't exist at all. Problem number one. The mostly left-handed amino acids that should be equally right-handed and left-handed if they were Jurassic. They are not there. The laws of chemistry demonstrate that after death, amino acids go back to a 50-50 mixture of right and left-handed amino acids. The England's Royal Society published a time range for when this physical process to occur, which produces totally racemized amino acid in 100,000 to 1 million years maximum. So, obviously, that is not even close to 65 million years old. Another problem, the amino acid methionine is very susceptible to strong oxidizing agents like hydrosol, which would quickly oxidize methionine into methionine sulfoxide. The Nature Communications study results revealed unoxidized methionine in some of the Alberta dinosaur specimens. Also consider this. The research on the Egyptian mummies has established a 10,000-year upper limit for how long biological molecules can survive. Now, back to iron for just a moment. If you want to see the rescuing device for iron preservation fail in real time, it's easy. Just look for yourself. One of the most striking examples of soft tissue preservation in dinosaur fossils. If you look at the photos in the paper, you see no evidence of iron particles. The only place she saw iron was inside partially degraded tissue. You see, iron in blood, which gets released at death, cannot preserve all soft tissue decay for millions of years because it still degrades collagen proteins, which have also been found in some specimens. So while iron might preserve some soft tissue, it obviously is not responsible for all soft tissue preservation. Also consider that iron would be incapable of preserving soft dinosaur tissue if it could actually distribute it from the dinosaur's blood throughout all the tissue. Of course, Mary Schweitzer and her team totally submerged specimens to preserve them to obtain the results they desired. But the only way to accomplish this naturally is distributed by water. Well, guess what? That brings up another huge problem, as water also degrades soft tissue before iron can preserve it. In addition to this, soft tissue has also been found in bones not directly associated with iron-rich blood, like in the bone horn of the Triceratops and bird feathers. The old Earth idea was developed historically, not from letting the physical facts speak for themselves, but by imposing anti-biblical philosophical assumptions onto their geological observations, the idea driving the conclusion. The new rave in evolutionism is that birds are just dinosaurs and that dinosaurs evolved into birds. There is a joke that KFC should change its name to KFD, Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. But not all of evolutionary scientists accept this nonsense. A proponent is one renowned ornithologist, Alan Feducci of the University of North Carolina. He recently stated, "The theory that birds are the equivalent of living dinosaurs and that dinosaurs were feathered is full of holes, so much so that creationists have jumped all over it." He further laments, "With the advent of feathered dinosaurs, we are truly witnessing the beginning of the meltdown of the field of paleontology. Those looking for evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs will be disappointed, because the Creator told us that He created birds before land animals, such as dinosaurs." The old Earth idea was developed historically, not from letting the physical facts speak for themselves, but by imposing anti-biblical philosophical assumptions onto their geological observations, the idea driving the conclusion.
I'm used to debating evolution, so it's good to change it up once in a while. So let's get started then. Debate, did dinosaurs or could dinosaurs have lived with man? Now, when I look at this picture, when I think of Jurassic Park, I sometimes assume that the evolutionists think of Jurassic Park and the massive T-Rex and all the commotion and tyranny that it caused when they think of dinosaurs and living with man. Therefore, they think it to be impossible. And it's pretty common for evolutionists to make the claim that since many dinosaurs were gigantic and dangerous, they couldn't have possibly lived with humans, as people would be easy prey for them. What the evolutionists don't acknowledge, however, is that according to their own timeline, humans have lived with plenty of large, dangerous animals over thousands of years, many of which are now extinct. Look at my slides here. We see the woolly mammoth and the American mastodon, with the same size as modern elephants, as well as this extinct relative of the Komodo dragon, which was likely encountered by the early settlers of Australia. Now, these types of animals would have proved to be a significant threat to people if anybody got close to them, and yet humans were still able to work around them, and in some cases hunt them. If you acknowledge that humans coexisted with these animals, it isn't that big of a step to suggest humans lived with dinosaurs, many of which were the same size or smaller than the animals listed in these slides. Here we can see the auroch, the short-faced bear, glyptodonts. These, even according to the evolutionists, all lived with man. Evolutionists have hijacked dinosaurs and used them to teach millions of years of evolution. When you start with the Bible, dinosaurs start to make a lot of sense. We see the geologic column here. Can man and dinosaur coexist? Well, when we look to the Bible, dinosaurs and man, according to our model, did not live in the same habitat. Just like today, we see that different creatures and different animals live in different habitats. In the pre-flood world, we see certain fossils that are usually buried together, and dinosaur fossils are usually buried with gymnosperms, pines, and naked sea plants, whereas mammal fossils are usually buried with things such as flowering plants. What does this actually indicate? This indicates two different ecosystems. For example, since we're talking about dinosaurs here, although lived at the same time of man, did not necessarily live in the same areas or habitats. They were overcome by the flood at different times during the advancing of the waters, which does explain why we don't find them buried together. It is evident that as the floodwaters rose, they buried organisms in the order that they were encountered. The accepted major groups known in the fossil record are explained by their appearance according to where they lived and not when they lived. So we looked at burial, ecosystems, and habitats. Now, we can actually look to geology, which does point to a watery cataclysm. Much geologic evidence suggests rapid plate tectonics. This isn't the topic of the debate, but when we look to the layering and we look to the dinosaurs and where they're found, we can also look to the flood to confirm that. So man and dinosaur could obviously coexist, but the question is, did they? We looked at dinosaurs in the Bible. Why don't we see the word dinosaur in the Bible? I hear this question from evolutionists all the time. Well, the word dinosaur is a modern word invented in 1841. The King James Version of the Bible, on the other hand, was translated in 1611. The word dinosaur did not exist at the time the King James Bible was translated, obviously. And so it's not surprising that we would not find the word dinosaur in the Bible. We also don't find the word computer in the Bible either. Dragons. We do find the word dragon in the Bible. These giant creatures known as dinosaurs were simply called dragons. Sightings of dragons / dinosaurs have been documented and recorded throughout history. Eyewitnesses from all cultures around the earth, from England to China, have legends and stories about dragons. There are even more than 20 references to dinosaurs in the Bible. This whole controversy could easily have been avoided if they had just called dinosaur bones dragon bones. We see that the evidence that humans knew about dinosaurs before the science of paleontology was founded. How much time do I have, James?
You've got
3 minutes.
I've got about 3.5, but I started a little bit late, so.
Awesome. So we see accurate artwork depicting dinosaurs and allegedly extinct creatures is observed, proving that ancient people saw living dinosaurs. The evolutionary community is baffled and surprised when plants and animals assumed to have gone extinct at the same time as the dinosaurs are suddenly found to be alive. These are known as living fossils. The coelacanth comes to mind. Here's a picture of the coelacanth. The evidence. Dinosaurs have been documented in history by eyewitnesses such as Marco Polo, Herodotus, and Alexander the Great. There exists today a multitude of cave drawings, mosaics, sculptures, and paintings of dinosaurs from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cambodia, Europe, Australia, all over the earth. Here's a picture here that was drawn, I believe, in Utah. This picture here, Bishop Bell's dinosaur. In the 15th century, we have Bishop Bell's tomb. We know when he died, and so we know how old this is, and this is much before dinosaur fossils have really been found. Not until the 1800s were dinosaur fossils actually found in bulk. We find carved animals in this tomb, and some of these animals, as you've seen, look exactly like dinosaurs, sauropod dinosaurs to be exact. Many of the carved animals are animals alive today, plus dinosaurs. What more proof do you need? We see this painting of the plesiosaur-like creature. The Australian Aborigines painted this painting of a creature that they believe lives in a lake that they won't go near because they're afraid of it. This painting looks exactly like a plesiosaur, which is not a true dinosaur, but had flippers and lived in the water, of course. We know there are countless legends of lake monsters and thousands of testimonies. Was everybody lying? That's what the evolutionist is going to have to conclude. People clearly knew about dinosaurs. I just had to pick a few here, but there's tons. You can look at them yourselves. People have obviously always known about dinosaurs if they drew them. It's conclusive evidence, really. The evidence is clear. Man coexisting with dinosaurs is obvious after looking at the overwhelming amount of evidence. The evidence is staggering due to the endless artifacts, drawings, carvings, statues, mosaics, and depictions throughout history of various dinosaurs or other thought to be extinct animals. We look to the Bible, we hear of a beast called Behemoth who had a tail like a cedar tree. People who have to hold to that evolutionary worldview, they'll say things like Behemoth was obviously a hippo or an elephant. We can go through this, but obviously where the Bible says he moves his tail like a cedar, well, if you've looked at an elephant and a hippo's tail looks nothing like a cedar. For sake of time, I'll move on here. It's all based on their worldview. When people say Behemoth cannot be a dinosaur, we see historical accounts, St. George killing a dragon, Beowulf, Alexander the Great. We even see it in empirical scientific evidence, soft tissue and dino bones. New scientific findings have revealed amazingly preserved dinosaur bones, which contain soft tissues, flexible blood vessels, and intact cells. Did you say that was time, James?
Nope, you got about 10 seconds.
This indicates these bones are thousands of years old and not millions. Oakley Abembe, look at that.
Yes, there is plenty of evidence that dinosaurs lived with man and even went on Noah's Ark. All you have to do is mention the word dinosaur on Noah's Ark or dinosaurs living with man in, say, recent times will lead to scoffing from the atheists, from the evolutionists. But the fact is, this evidence of dinosaurs living with man and that the Bible's history of this universe is accurate is overwhelming. There's actual historic, scientific, and even eyewitness evidence, ample evidence for this. And the fact is that more and more evidence actually continues to be discovered, which actually proves that everything we've been taught about dinosaurs is absolutely wrong. Dinosaurs have been documented in history by eyewitnesses. A few examples that come to mind are Alexander the Great, Marco Polo, Herodotus. You can look for yourself. There exists massive amounts of cave drawings, mosaics, paintings, scriptures, sculptures of dinosaurs from ancient Egypt, Cambodia, Europe, Australia, North America, pretty much all over the earth. And in the scripture, we see the description of dinosaur-like animals: Leviathan, Behemoth. The word dragon is used over and over again. And these sculptures, mosaics, paintings, cave drawings that I talk about, you can actually go see them yourself. We even have documentation of the existence of completely fresh, non-fossilized dinosaur bones. What is unfortunate is that people have been brainwashed, and not only brainwashed, but conditioned to believe that these dinosaurs are actually prehistoric animals, beasts that lived until about 65 million years ago. But the fact is, these evolutionary scientists, they're dedicated to convincing you that dinosaurs lived long before man. Because what they have to do, they're like salesmen, evolutionary salesmen. They have to sell you the story, the fairy tale that comes right out of SpongeBob La La Land, that pine trees, whales, and dinosaurs are all related through common ancestry. So if dinosaurs were actually alive within the last few thousand years, this theory of evolution, pond scum to people evolution, becomes highly unlikely. Now, dinosaurs to begin with, they're nothing more than reptiles that continue to grow in size. And most people that I talk to, most people that you will talk to, they seem to be unaware of the fact that reptiles never stop growing in size while they're alive. For example, as humans, we know that our noses and ears never stop growing. And same with mammals and most of the animal kingdom. They grow to a certain size, then stop growing. While they do get older, they don't get any bigger. But with reptiles, as I've stated earlier, they continue to grow in size until the day they die. Let's take a tortoise that has lived over 100 years. It's known and documented that they get to be the size of a bathtub. Imagine a tortoise that could live up to 500 years. They'd be the size of a garage. Now, when we actually examine dinosaurs, and if we look to the biblical record of history, say before Noah's flood, we know that man lived to be hundreds of years old. Methuselah, for example, lived to be 969 years old. And after the flood, when the lifespan of man was decreased based on the after effects of the flood, based on genetic entropy, the accumulation of low impact, deleterious mutations, the ages of man have dropped off. Take that back to a point of, say, least genetic entropy. Imagine if these animals had the ability to live that long as well. We know today that reptiles never stop growing in size throughout their entire lifetime. Therefore, picture a Komodo dragon, picture a gecko. What are they going to look like after 500 years? Can you say dinosaur? Now, to not get into too much detail about the biblical evidence, let's look at the evidence of dinosaurs living with man in recent history. Because like I said earlier, it's overwhelming due to the countless artifacts, drawings, mosaics, carvings, depictions. You can see depictions of Brachiosaurus, plesiosaurs, pterodactyls, triceratops, T-Rex, and many, many more. The question is, for the evolutionists, if man didn't live with these creatures, how did artists throughout ancient history and in cultures all over the world happen to draw these animals, to recreate these giant beasts? Was it just all coincidence that it turns out that they look nearly identical to what we see in the books about dinosaurs in museums today? I've heard evolutionists say, well, they must have seen dinosaur skeletons back then too, and that's how they were able to recreate them and draw them. And it's not just a coincidence. They've seen the bones. But the thing is, this argument fails tremendously. And the reason why is that dinosaur skeletons, they're not just found lying on the ground intact, as if someone's gonna walk by, look down and see what that dinosaur looked like. The bones are always fragmented, they're separated, and they're embedded deep within the ground or within the rock. And most of them are missing. Occasionally, yes, you might find a piece of a single bone, say, sticking out of a rock here and there. But at the end of the day, that's pretty much all that we actually find. And if you actually think about this logically, what does logic say? That's all anyone in ancient history would have been able to find as well. And there's no way they would have been able to create that image of the entire animal, the entire dinosaur, without the entire skeleton. We know that the science of paleontology did not develop until the early 1800s. It's all rescue device after rescue device and post hoc, ad hoc explanations coming from the evolutionist side. This process of digging out and excavating dinosaur bones from, say, rock didn't begin until then. And as a consequence, the first complete skeleton of a dinosaur was not constructed until the 1800s. The word dinosaur, which everybody knows means, great or terrible lizard, it didn't exist before 1841. That's when it was coined. But that doesn't mean dinosaurs didn't exist. It just means that these giant animals, these reptiles, these creatures weren't called dinosaurs before 1841. This is what logic dictates. They were called dragons, and what do we see? Thousands of dragon legends from cultures all around the world. Dragon sightings have been documented and recorded throughout history by eyewitnesses. They've been part of all sorts of legends and cultures all around the earth, from China to England to everywhere. And as I said earlier, there's even over 20 references to dinosaurs in the Bible. But of course, if the word dinosaur wasn't coined until 1841, they were not called dinosaurs, they were called dragons, since the word didn't exist yet. This all fits perfectly within a biblical base model. So how did these people 2,000-3,000 years ago, how did they know almost exactly what dinosaurs look like? Listen guys, there's only two options. Either logically, they saw the dinosaurs with their own eyes, or they could have constructed the skeletons. There's not really a third logical option that won't sound ridiculous at the end of the day. So if we actually look into these explanations, and we look at, say, civilizations throughout history, to think that they actually knew exactly what dinosaurs looked like in detail by just seeing, dinosaur skeletons, at the end of the day, that's not logical. Because as I said earlier, the first skeleton was not even put together until the 1800s. And there's not as many dinosaur skeletons as you'd think. The fossil record, we can look to paleontologist Dr. Kurt Wise. He's got a PhD in geology from Harvard University. He'll tell you, this is confirmed. This is fact that only 0.0025% of the entire fossil record consists of more than a single bone of vertebrate animals. And after nearly hundreds of years, 200 years to be exact, of paleontology, we have now been able to come up with just a few fossils of large dinosaurs. And there's almost no evidence in history of previous civilizations digging and excavating bones, let alone creating entire skeletons, as some of these evolutionary apologists would have you believe. But remember, they need to hang on to that primary assumption that pond scum to people evolution is true. At best, if you want to give them something, someone in history maybe found an occasional large bone shard, say in the ground, and tell their buddies, okay, this belonged to some type of big animal, but it's not logical at all. As a matter of fact, it's illogical to believe that they could, with their imagination, guess exactly what, say, a Tyrannosaurus or a Brachiosaurus or a Triceratops would look like. Or any other dinosaurs for that matter. I could go on and on and on. Plesiosaurs, for example. How would they know that these depictions were identical to what they actually look like? The ones that we see in these artworks, the cave drawings, the sculptures, the mosaics, and writings. Writings that we can go into thoroughly throughout history and from many different cultures around the world. Usually, and what it is about legends, thousands of legends, is they come from a common source. Ask yourself, whether you're a believer, you're on the fence, or you're a critic, if these dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago before modern man evolved, and the first dinosaur skeleton was then not excavated and constructed until the early 1800s, how did human artwork throughout all of history just so perfectly manage to come out and depict several types of dinosaurs that look absolutely identical to the dinosaur depictions we see in the science books today? It's a simple answer, guys, as everything is. Start with a biblical-based model, a biblical-based assumption. What's the answer? They drew what they saw with their own eyes.
Mankind has always reported his experience with dinosaurs. Throughout human history, man has recorded his experience with dinosaurs. Now, evolutionists, because they refuse to believe real science and history, true history, that man has actually dwelt with and lived with and engaged with dinosaurs and combated, in fact, dinosaurs, they have speculated that the reasons that human beings have had these legends of dragons and these monstrous beasts in the past, these are just myths. They're imagined in the imagination of mankind. The most prominent explanation they give, which is the best argument they can really put forth, is that ancient man saw dinosaur fossils protruding from rocks and therefore pieced together what the organism looked like, and then postulated that human beings must have engaged with these things, or there were. Well, that fails for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if they were looking at fossils, why would they continue to write for century after century, long after the fossil had been created, that they were engaging with these creatures? See, that doesn't even make sense. The creature is dead in the rock, but they're talking about creatures that live. Problem. Second problem is, by looking at the fossils, they would not have been able to get an accurate depiction of what the creature looked like. And this is provable, and I'm about to prove that to you. For example, what you see on the screen right now is a 19th century, that is 1800s, depiction of what the best scientific minds at the time believed iguanodon looked like on the left. But modern 20th century anatomists who are experts at studying bone structure, how much weight those bones would have carried, and where organs would have been placed, and how much musculature there would have been around surrounding specific bones, using 20th century technology in a number of ways, come up with the picture you see on the right. The one on the right is accurate. That's what modern technology has provided us. This is what an iguanodon actually looked like. Very similar. I mean, not possibly 100% accurate, but very close to what the organism really looked like. On the left, you see what 19th century men, the best minds in science, probably thought iguanodon looked like. Now, here's another one. This is Megalosaurus. This is a gigantic sloth-like animal. This is a 19th century reproduction of what they thought this Megalosaurus looked like, and the 20th century depiction of it. The one on the right is scientifically derived by studying the bones, muscularity of organisms, etc. The one on the left is made in an unscientific era, like evolution theory was founded in an unscientific era, where man had virtually no knowledge of biological systems at all. That's what they thought the organism looked like. On the left, we see here another example of an animal, a dinosaur. This is a 19th century depiction of it. On the right, you see the 20th century understanding of what the creature actually looked like. These are not the same. Here's another. This is a Sumatran created depiction of dinosaurs housed in the Ethnographical Museum in Budapest. Notice a couple of things about the creatures that they depict here. Firstly, there's a crest on the head, and there's a wattle under the neck. Now, some scientists today say that this creature, Coryanthrus, had a wattle, and some say it didn't, but nonetheless, why would the ancients have depicted the creature with a wattle under its neck and a crest on its head? You have to wonder. It could only be because they'd seen it. Now, if you're going to say this is a chicken, where's its wings? It's not. It's a dinosaur. Look at the size of it in comparison to the men. This is an exaggeration. The creature would actually be much larger than that. That's not a chicken. Here's the next one. This is Edmontosaurus. Now, on the left is a Native American depiction of Edmontosaurus in a rock. And on the right, we see Edmontosaurus. This is an accurate depiction of, again, a known species of dinosaur created by ancient man. The reason this creature is standing upright like this is this, just like a black bear, when he becomes in a situation where he's in a threatening situation, he stands upright to make himself look as big and powerful and mean and bad as he possibly can. And so this creature stands upright saying, hey, look at me. Don't mess with me, pal. I'll take you out. This is what this creature is doing. And the Native Americans would never have drawn a two-legged creature, a creature that has two prominent legs, thighs, with a long tail and a head downcast like that, unless they had seen it with with our own eyes. Here's another. This one is astonishing. It blows me away. Hanshan culture in China. This is a depiction of a protoceratops with its head down in a conflict. It's believed by even modern evolutionist scientists believe that protoceratops, triceratops, and other ceratopian dinosaurs engaged in headbutting, just like goats, mountain goats do, as a conflict to determine who's going to be the winner over the herd, who gets all the girls. And here we have a beautiful depiction of it right there. Here's another ancient Chinese depiction. Notice the textured of the skin. Ancient early 19th century and early 20th century depictions of dinosaurs did not have the textured skin because they did not believe that the skin was textured. Fossilized dinosaur skin has been found and it shows that it's textured. So here we have a skull with and a spine with crests going all the way down the back of the creature. We have an upturned spine on the top of the skull, and we have an upturned nose. The comparison is astonishing. There's no reason to believe that these ancients would have depicted such a creature unless they had actually seen it. Then we find fossil evidence of the very creature that they depicted. Here's another one. This is in Ontario, Canada. And this is possibly one of the most profound evidences that man lived with dinosaurs on the earth. This is a sauropod dinosaur depicted by Native Americans in Utah. It's nobody, and I mean nobody, would look at this picture and not know that that is a sauropod dinosaur. You could show that picture to a 3-year-old and they would say, dinosaur, because obviously it's a dinosaur. Now, to believe that people depicted these creatures and then, which are accurate reproductions of creatures that actually did exist in the past and think they got it right by chance is not believable. It's not. This rock is from ancient Israel. On the left, you see an enhanced photograph so you can see what it looks like better. And on the right, you see an actual photograph in real color of the actual stone. This is from an ancient temple in Israel. We have a dinosaur attacking a horse. Next to it, on the left, is a 2-legged dinosaur with its mouth wide open thinking, hey, I want some of that animal too. What animal has ever lived on the earth that had a head that size in relation to a horse? Only a dinosaur. Now here's another one. This is a beautiful one. Stegosaurus on a Cambodian temple built about 1100 AD. Now evolutionists say these are flowers or leaves in the background, and they depicted a pig in the front of it. No, not if you look at the rest of the temple. You see known species of animals not depicted like that. That doesn't make sense. These spines are actually part of the animal's anatomy. This is a Stegosaurus depicted in 1100 AD. This is from the palette of King Narmer. This is from Egyptian. Okay, 1 minute. This is a detail of it. These are sauropod dinosaurs with their necks curled. Here's that sauropod dinosaur from Native America. This is ancient Babylonian. 2 sauropod dinosaurs. Notice the crest on the skull. The crest. Why would they depict a crest? Because they saw the creature. Now, here again, this is another Babylonian depiction of 2 sauropod dinosaurs with crested skulls. And we know that species today, and there they are. Here is an ancient Palestinian. This is called the Nile mosaic of the Palestina. And the words there say crocodile leopard in Greek. And this is Greek men looking at what kind of creature is that? What do you think that is? Anybody who looks at this picture thinks dinosaur. Nobody doesn't. Here in Biloxi, Texas, along the riverbed, they're excavating in early 1970s, excavating layers of rock using heavy equipment at Glen Rose, Texas. And this is what they found. They found dinosaur and human tracks in the same strata of rock. Now, the evolutionists say these are not real human tracks. Notice they never say that the tracks are not dinosaur tracks, but they only say these tracks that are found there that look like human tracks are not human. These are, after excavation, there they are, These are early images from the early 1970s. Now here we have the same photograph before and after. Here we go. Here's a photograph of the, notice I've marked footprint for footprint, the same scene photographed by a photographer early and then 20 years later, and we see the photographs. If that's not a human footprint, I don't know what is. That's not a dinosaur footprint, but evolutionists claim it is. That is not a dinosaur footprint. It does not match the anatomy of a dinosaur. I'm going to prove that to you. This is a popular picture passed around by evolutionists, written by an evolutionist who says, look, the mud fell in where the dinosaur stepped. Now look at the shape of the foot. Now, here's what they actually found. That's a theropod, three-toed dinosaur. You can see the mud collapsing at the top. There's your mud collapse right there. That's mud collapsing. But you can clearly see this is a theropod dinosaur footprint. But what's with this part that's in the green circle I wrote? This is a real dinosaur foot. They don't have a heel. Dinosaurs, the three-toed dinosaurs do not have a heel. So why does it have this? Right? So here's what they actually found. That's what they found. Look what they found. Look, Drew. The evolutionist himself makes the case for the creationist. He shows that the creature has a arch and a heel and claims the toes are an example of mud collapsing. No, that's mud collapsing. That is a human foot with mud collapsing around it. I'm going to show you a better example of that when I find it. I thought I had a slide for that. Apparently I don't. Nonetheless, this fossil right here kills all the evolutionist arguments. This is the most fantastic fossil ever found. It is a Protoceratops engaged in a fight with a velociraptor. Now, it may not have been a velociraptor, but it was a raptor of some kind, for sure, they know. And in this fossil is captured in three-dimensional space. These animals were buried alive while they were engaged in a fight. In the mouth of the Protoceratops is the raptor's hand. He has got his mouth on it. And the velociraptor is clawing at the head of the Protoceratops, trying to stop him from breaking his bones. They were buried so fast that these creatures were buried in place in thick, fluid sediments and frozen in place. They could no longer move. And you have a three-dimensional fossil of a velociraptor and a Protoceratops engaged in a fight to the death, which of course the Protoceratops would easily win, frozen in space. Now, this is a three-dimensional fossil. It is the most extraordinary fossil that's ever been found. This can only happen if these two creatures were buried so quickly in sediments that were so loose yet so thick at the same time, like moving sand that is full of water but not necessarily sand, like mud, that they were literally frozen, encased in space and stopped and had no ability to move their limbs from that moment forward. They were just whoosh, and that's it. They're frozen in space. That was it. They can no longer move. Their limbs were where they were, and they could not move them left to the right, 1 inch, 2 inches. They're frozen in space. Flooded, this happens immediately. This cannot happen over time, and this kills all the evolutionist arguments about evolution theory and about vast ages of time and fossilization and everything. So with this photograph, I wipe away all the evolutionist belief of vast ages of time and fossilization. They're gone. Now, all fossils of dinosaurs, therefore, are creatures which were buried immediately by sediments. That's a scientific fact. Okay, so because of that, we can know that whenever we find a fossil of a dinosaur, it's a creature that was buried rapidly, as the fossil record proves, and there was no geologic time involved. This wipes away all of the evolutionists' imaginary evolutionary time for the creation, for the arrival and existence and extinction of living things. It's gone. I'm sorry. That one photograph that I showed you destroys all evolutionist arguments about geologic time. Period. Period. There is no argument that can be levied against this fossil. 2 large dinosaurs weighed hundreds of pounds. The Protoceratops probably weighed anywhere from 800 to 1,100 pounds, frozen in space immediately, that fast, and frozen in time. Fossilization is not something that takes millions of years. I just wiped away for you all the evolutionists' imaginary time.
Have you ever had an evolutionist tell you, just show me one out-of-place fossil? Because, you know, they say the geologic column is so perfectly organized it matches the evolution theory so well. Well, that's not true. Every living fossil, and there are tens of thousands of them, is an out-of-place fossil. Because they can't have existed unchanged for all these millions of years if random mutation and natural selection are what morphs organisms so that new kinds of life are produced over time. So every living fossil, all tens of thousands of them, are all out of place. Now other UPART, that's out of place artifacts. Now, every UPART fossil that has been found, an evolutionist will deny. Here's just one. Isn't this funny? National Geographic. Dinosaur found in mammal's belly. You see, that can't be if evolution theory is correct. Because, you know, they say that mammals evolved on the planet long after the dinosaurs were gone. They didn't coexist, according to evolutionists. But in China, they found a fossil of a mammal, and in its belly was a small dinosaur. Probably its last meal before the flood of Noah buried the thing alive. And it causes them to do this. Rethinking the Mesozoic. Oh, they've got to rethink their theory a little bit. Well, you know what they'll do. They'll just modify a little bit and keep on going. Keep pushing that evolution theory because God didn't create anything and you're living a lie if you don't believe naturalism, evolutionism, determinism, materialism, moral relativism are all to truth. Isn't it so funny? Now here's what they're going to do. They're just going to modify their theory a little bit and keep on pushing it. As everything is okay. It's always okay. You see, there's never a problem for evolution theory. They just adjust the theory a little bit and keep on going. It's never a problem for evolution theory. Never. There's no problems with evolution theory. We just modify the theory and keep on going.
Here's an article on CNN.com. They found a dinosaur print at the Goddard Space Flight Center on the ground. And there it is, you can see it. It's a theropod dinosaur footprint. And here's the mud rock or whatever kind of stone this is. And they say this is millions of years old. They call it from the Cretaceous, they say. Now, funny thing is, it hasn't eroded away. Look at that. Now, you mean to tell me that in 60 million years or so, this rock has not eroded away because of wind and rain and water flowing over it in 60 plus million years? No, my friends, this dinosaur print isn't 60 million years old. It's probably a few thousand years old. I find it so funny that these secular guys, these goons who believe in evolution and claim it's the truth, find things like this and then they go away scratching their head how come it's not eroded away. And it's right there on the surface, a dinosaur footprint, right on the surface. Not eroded away. Now see, they would have you believe that in 60 million years, quite a bit of erosion is going to take place. That's what they believe.
And I would say so too. I would say in 60 million years, a lot of erosion is going to happen. There's not going to be any dinosaur footprints on the surface of the Earth. They didn't have to dig down for this. It's right there. There's not going to be any dinosaur footprints on the surface of the Earth where there's dirt around it and grass growing. See the grass? Grass, look. It's not going to be there for 60 million years. But these guys, they believe it is. Isn't that funny? That's humorous. 60 million years ago, they say. Right. You know what's funny? This unimaginable stretching of the real history of the Earth that these guys do. These evolutionist kind. They stretch the life of this planet to an unfathomable amount of time. It's thousands of times older in their mind than it really is. Many, many thousands of times older than it actually is. Isn't that funny? Just thought I'd share that with you. Supposedly millions and millions and millions and millions of years old. It's right there on the surface where grass is growing and stuff. So. And it didn't wear down. It didn't wear away. It didn't erode. In all those millions of years. No, I tell you what happened. That dinosaur stepped there just a few thousand years ago. But these guys can't see the truth. They're blinded.
Steve Brading mentioned in his prepared remarks how tree ring data allows you to link together different pieces of wood where the tree ring patterns are the same, that stretches out 14,000 years. I don't think that's the case at all. These are so-called long chronologies. The oldest tree ring, the oldest tree growing, bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California, has 4,600 rings. That's the oldest one, called the Methuselah tree. They don't use that in this long chronology. And when you examine how they develop these long chronologies, I see some things that aren't very rigorous. First of all, they inject, they say certain rings are missing and they cannot allow it to overlap. They'll take a sequence of rings that match another piece of wood and they'll say, okay, they overlap and that allows us to have a longer sequence. But what they do when they find an old piece of wood, they first radiocarbon date it. And then look and see, and if it's old, then they see maybe we can extend the long chronology. And if we can, we'll publish a paper. Our laboratory, such as the Dendrochronology Laboratory at the University of Arizona, the biggest one around, then we will have the longest chronology. We will get the research dollars when archaeologists want to have something dated by tree rings. And yet they refuse, and I have sat with the director of that laboratory for a half a day asking him, why won't you let a statistical analysis be done to see if there truly is an overlap? I happen to know from a person who's worked in that lab that they do what I would consider circular reasoning. They do radiocarbon date the slab of wood before they see if they can find a fit. And they do let the human eye and judgment decide, is it a fit? Far better to do it statistically. And a friend of mine has even sent them a computer program to say, well, if you're not going to release the data to us, then please run this computer program. It'll tell you how much confidence you have that there is a fit that allows that long 14,000-year chronology. They haven't done it. Ferguson, who died about 4 years ago, he kept his tree ring raw wood locked in a safe. And at a conference of dendrochronologists, they asked, can we see your wood? And he said, no, I'm afraid creationists will get a hold of it. That's closed-minded.
those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.